You knew which path I would take.
I knew which path you preferred. I watched you take it twice.
The fire took a long time to catch. I remember noticing that. Marquis Bradley had given the order in that clipped imperial tone that made everything sound like a budget meeting, and the soldier had touched the torch to the kindling at my feet, and the kindling had smoked for a moment before deciding to cooperate. I stood chained to the stake and watched it happen with something close to academic interest, because by then I had nothing else to feel. They had stripped me of everything already: the deed to the barony, the granary keys, the 6,000 gold I had scraped together from 12 years of bad harvests, worse wars, and one plague that killed everyone I loved in the space of a single autumn. I had handed it all over in the negotiation so that the people of Estor could keep their lives and their homes and their cooking pots. Marquis Bradley had not looked grateful. He had looked efficient. It was a fair trade by the terms of war. I knew that. I had accepted it. What I had not fully accepted until I was standing in front of a crowd of 3,000 people on a cold morning was that accepting it would feel exactly like this. Then the kneeling started. The first one was Anne. I recognized the red of her hair before I recognized her face because she had her head down. She knelt in the mud of the town square in front of a watching imperial regiment, and she said, loud enough for the people in the back rows to hear, that she knew. She knew that no matter what anyone said, I had always treasured the people of this land. Just the specifics, just the record, straight. I felt something shift in my chest that I had not expected to feel. Misery was next. She had worked beside me for 3 years, managing accounts that never balanced no matter how carefully we calculated, and she knelt in the same mud and said she knew I had desperately tried to restore the crumbling land for the people's sake. She said it the way she said everything, measured and precise, and in a tone that would have been appropriate for a budget report. Then Rosa, then Claire, then a woman I recognized as the daughter of a grain merchant whose store had closed 2 years ago, and I had not realized until she knelt and started speaking that she had been in the kitchen lines during the famine. 5 women in the mud, reciting what I had done, and the crowd, which had arrived in the mood of a public spectacle, went quiet in a way that is different from silence. I had watched crowds my whole life. I knew the difference between a crowd that is merely not speaking and a crowd that has stopped breathing. I thought, was I this popular? Then I thought, how ironic. It is too late now. A voice spoke, not from the crowd, not from Marquis Bradley. It was mechanical and clean and came from somewhere inside my own chest, and it said that my land appraisal authority had manifested, that the dormant magic I had spent 20 years failing to produce had finally activated, and my listing in this territory's history was now complete. The fire reached me about 1 second after that. I did not try to process what the voice had said. There was not time to process it. There was only the heat, and the 5 faces below me, and the specific quality of the light on that morning, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, I was looking at ceiling beams, wooden ceiling beams, not stone, warm light through a curtained window, soft bedding underneath me, the smell of milk and clean linen, and a sound nearby that I eventually identified as my own crying, and then the startled footsteps of a 19-year-old woman rushing in to pick up her infant son. I was a baby. This required some processing. My mother held me and made the sounds people make when they pick up crying infants, and I stopped crying not because I was comforted, but because I had identified the sound as my own voice and wanted to hear it stop. She attempted to feed me. I declined this. She looked confused. I considered the situation from the perspective of a man who had just been burned alive, processed 2 lifetimes of memory in a fog of shock and infant physiology, and concluded that there was a book beside the crib that had not been there before. It was thick, too thick for infant hands to open, but I could see it. The cover read, in Japanese, in handwriting that was specifically, unmistakably mine, History of the Soulless Barony. I had not written that book, not yet. Not in any life I remembered living, but the handwriting was mine in the way that certain nightmares are yours. You recognize them even before you understand what they mean. So the magic had worked. That was the first thing. The second thing was that the voice, in the final second before the fire, had said the skill had activated, time and space magic. And I had activated it at the execution, which meant I had traveled backward, and here I was, and the book was proof. My mother held me and made soft noises, and I lay in her arms and tried very hard not to think about Yuko. She would be in Tokyo right now. It was, I calculated, sometime in a modern Japan that I had left without warning, in a salaryman's body that had overworked itself into the ground, past age 50, while my wife quietly managed everything around me. She had gotten sick once, earlier, and recovered. I had not managed to tell her what I felt about that before I had done the very thing she had warned me about. out and worked myself into a hospital bed and then out the other side permanently. Yuko did not know I was here. Yuko did not know I was gone. Yuko was somewhere in a world I currently had no way to reach, and I was lying in the arms of a woman who was 19 years old and was my mother and smelled of earth and cooking fires and some flour that did not have a name in either language I thought in. I made myself stop. The disasters were the first problem. The grief was real, but it was not scheduled. The disasters were. I had 2 lives worth of memory and a book recording every catastrophe that would hit this family between now and the day I died again at the stake. I was ahead of all of them for the first time in either of my lives. That was the only useful fact at the moment. So I read the book when the household slept. It took 3 nights of squinting in moonlight, because infant hands are useless instruments. But by age 3, I had read enough to understand what I was holding. It was not a history, it was a schedule. Every disaster that was going to hit this family, written out in order with dates attached, 5 of them, each one worse than the last. And at the very end of the list, my own name and the date of my execution, the same morning I had just come from. I had 10 years before the first one arrived. I decided to start with woodworking. This sounds like an unusual priority, but I had 2 lifetimes of experience with people who did not take children seriously. And I knew that the most dangerous thing a small boy could do in a baron's household was propose infrastructure projects out of nowhere. The woodworking hobby was a cover that would let me spend time in a carpenter's workshop, building models of things I needed the territory to have without anyone asking questions a 5-year-old could not reasonably answer. My parents were delighted. I was their prodigy. I had spent 2 years reading every book in the manor and exhausting the library of every merchant who visited for trade, and they had told everyone who would listen that their second son was remarkable. This helped enormously with the woodworking request. They said yes immediately, with the condition that Anne accompany me. Anne. I had last seen Anne in my first life, that life, at my own execution. She had been kneeling in the mud with her head down. I had not, in that life, understood the distance between the girl assigned to watch me and the woman who chose to kneel for me, because I had been a little busy dying. In this life, she was 15, and she had been assigned to me specifically because Raymond had reassigned her from Derek when he became suspicious about the younger son's unusual behavior, and she met my woodworking expedition with her arms folded and an expression that communicated very clearly that she believed a baron's son had better places to be. She was right. I did not tell her that. The carpenter was a man named Gerd. He had the personality of a man who had spent 30 years being exact about things and expected everyone else to also be exact about things. And he looked at a 5-year-old in a nobleman's coat who wanted to watch him work, and he made the face of a man who had been asked to do something he would normally refuse. Then Anne looked at him. She did not say anything. She produced, simply by standing there and adjusting her posture slightly, an atmosphere that communicated that disagreement was possible, but would come with certain costs. Gerd agreed to let me observe. Over the following months, I built models, a water lifting wheel, a power wheel with gears, wooden leaf springs, pulleys. I built them carefully, with Carl the apprentice's patient help, and I built them to demonstrate what they could do rather than simply what they were. I was nervous the entire time. Raymond had a habit of appearing in rooms where I was working and watching with the expression of a man who had recognized a card trick being performed, and I knew that his question about where I had obtained this knowledge was not casual curiosity. It was the specific alertness of a man whose job was to protect this family from threats it could not see. I told him I had read about similar devices in a book from another country. He accepted this. He wrote it down. He watched me more closely after that. The demonstration for my parents went better than I deserved. My mother's face changed when I described irrigation. My father's face changed when I described milling. Raymond had his question ready before I finished speaking, and I gave him the book answer, and his expression said he did not fully believe it and would not say so yet. The next day, the survey went out. Within months, the water wheels were built and the canals were dug, and the carpenter Carl had become the head of a small production team, and Raymond was appearing at village meetings to propose raised floor granary designs as though the idea had occurred to him independently, which it had, I let him believe. We moved on to dried noodles, bamboo packaging, bulk grain purchases. While prices were low from the great harvest, I worked with the cook, a former soldier named Miguel, who had the instincts of a man who had once had to feed an army in the field, and understood that portable rations were not a luxury. He took the noodle concept and improved it past what I had originally envisioned, which was the best possible thing he could have done. The volcanic ash came when I was 7, exactly when the book said it would. I had been waiting for it, monitoring the southeastern mountains with the specific attention of a man who knew what the smoke meant. When the first gray dust settled on the windowsills of the manor, I called a meeting and explained to my parents and Raymond and Anne that the ashfall was a sign, that it might be, I was careful not to say definitely, a precursor to a larger eruption, that the harvest next year could fail, that we should prepare. My father looked at the ash on the windowsill for a long moment and then looked at his second son, who was 7 years old, and said, carefully, that he did not want to act on something uncertain. A second ashfall came 3 months later, just before harvest ended. My father looked at the ash again. His expression had changed into the expression of a man who had discovered a very good investment opportunity. He bought grain from every merchant willing to sell and kept quiet about his reasons. And by the time the drought hit in earnest, the Solis barony's granaries were full. The drought hit everyone. The Olg River dropped. The crops failed in the neighboring territories. My mother was already moving. She had the kind of earth magic that let her read the land's needs, and she ordered every water wheel in operation and every sluice gate opened and told the men operating them firmly not to drain the river dry because we were not the only ones in the basin. We issued turnip seeds. This requires some explanation. Turnips were livestock feed in this world. Nobody ate them. This was a cultural position that the neighboring Viscount Gorman held very strongly, and when I sent a message to his territory offering turnip seeds as famine relief, he sent back a message explaining that eating animal feed was beneath nobility. His people were hungry. I found this clarifying about certain categories of nobility. My mother's land had turnips growing in the mansion garden because I had been quietly expanding the planting for 3 years. Raymond had mobilized soldiers to farm fallow ground near the town. The cook had developed recipes. When the famine hit, people were hungry but not dying, and the territory's surplus grain, sold at inflated famine prices to merchants from further south, generated enough profit that my father stopped being annoyed at being called the turnip baron and started quietly enjoying it. 1 disaster down, 4 to go. I was 10 years old and running a refugee relief operation from a converted outbuilding near the eastern gate of Est when the mercenaries arrived. They came in a group of 30. They were armed, which was the first thing Anne noted. They were also gaunt, which was the second thing, and their equipment was good quality but badly maintained, which told me they had not been paid recently, which told me they had been abandoned. I directed them to the registration desk the same as anyone else. They complied without complaint, which told me their captain had given them instructions before they walked through the gate. The captain came back later. He was young, younger than I had expected for someone leading 30 armed men, and he had the kind of physical presence that makes other people step slightly aside without realizing they are doing it. He had found out that the Baron's second son had designed the relief system. He came to thank me personally. He introduced himself as Vice Schwarztfalke, captain of the double-headed Falcon Mercenary Company, 30 members. They had been contracted to Viscount Gorman, and Gorman had dismissed them without back pay when the famine worsened because paying soldiers was apparently also beneath certain categories of nobility. They were planning to cross through the Demon region into Griffonia Empire to find new employment. I heard the name Schwarztfalke and felt every sensation in my body stop working in sequence. The way lights go out in a building where someone has cut the main line. Weiss Schwarztfalke, the Black Hawk. The name in the history book was accompanied by a specific description, the general employed by Griffonia's third prince, who crossed the northern mountains and burned the Solis barony to the ground in the spring of my 20th year, who negotiated my surrender with the precision of a man who had already planned what would happen if I refused, who gave the order to light the fire. He was standing in front of me in a soup kitchen tent, thanking me for the turnip stew. He was 21 years old. He was exactly as the book had described him, except for the expression, which was not the expression of a conqueror, but of a man who had not eaten a real meal in 2 weeks and was genuinely grateful for one now. He had kind eyes. I had not expected that. The book had not mentioned the eyes. I kept my face completely still. I was 10 years old, and I was looking at the man who would kill me in 12 years, and I was performing the expression of a boy who was pleased that his soup kitchen was getting good reviews. "I don't look much like a lord's son," I said. "I get told that regularly." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not a performance. He had good manners for a mercenary, which meant he had been trained, which meant he had started from somewhere better than this, and been brought to this camp by a series of events I could trace directly back to Viscount Gorman's specific variety of petty cruelty. He thanked me again. He said his company would be leaving in the morning, heading south toward Griffonia. I made a decision the way I had learned to make decisions in my first life, very fast, with incomplete information, relying on the one thing I knew for certain. Letting him walk out of that camp was the specific action that created the man who burned me alive. There may be work available here. If you're willing to stay, I'd like to speak to my father about it. Weiss looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who had been offered something he had not expected and was trying to decide whether to trust it. I'll hear what you have to say. It was not agreement. It was a delay. I had bought a day. I went to find my father. The flood came 3 months after Weiss and his 30 men signed their contracts and set up in the barracks on the eastern edge of the estate. It came in the night. The Olg River rose past its banks for the first time in living memory, and the lower fields went under, and the villages in the floodplain woke to water at their doorsteps. The granaries were elevated, the raised floors held, the raised floor design that the village chief of the first village had resisted so strenuously 2 years earlier, for the very good reason that it was inconvenient, held against 3 feet of floodwater without losing a single sack. Not one person in the Solus barony died of hunger that year. I was 10 years old, standing in the courtyard of the manor in the gray dawn after the flood peaked, watching the waterline recede from the barn wall while Anne stood beside me with a lamp and said nothing. The silence was one of the more comfortable silences I had experienced in either of my lives. One item remained on the list for this phase of things. Keep Weiss here. He was employed. He had 30 men, fed and housed and paid, which he had not had 3 months ago. He had been given real work, training, logistics, the kind of structured problem solving that his talent was suited for. Whether that was enough to hold him was not something the book could tell me. The book recorded what happened in the original timeline. It did not record what was happening now. I had changed things already. I could feel the weight of that in the specific way you feel the ground shift under you in a flood. You cannot see what has moved, but you know something has. The 5 faces from the execution were behind me now, somewhere in the future that I was trying to build differently. Anne was beside me, not kneeling in mud, but standing with a lamp in her hand. The flood had been survived. The granaries held. That would have to be enough for today. The thing nobody tells you about meeting the man who killed you is that he is usually perfectly pleasant. Weiss had good manners. He arrived to training on time, gave honest feedback, and told the same 3 camp stories with enough variation that you could almost believe he had not told them before. He was 21 years old, and he carried the specific quality of a man who had seen things and decided not to make a production of it. He was, objectively, an excellent sword instructor for a 10-year-old who could not hold a form to save his life. He was also the man who had set me on fire 12 years from now. I kept this fact in a small locked room in my memory and did not visit it more often than necessary. What I needed from Weiss was what Weiss had to offer: his tactical mind, his loyalty once given, and above all, his presence here in this territory, rather than across the border in Griffonia. Every morning he walked into the training courtyard and gave me a critique of my footwork and was not in Griffonia. That was the important thing. 3 months into sword lessons, Derek was already advancing fast, which was gratifying for reasons that had nothing to do with brotherly pride. I asked Raymond to arrange a longer conversation, not about the training, about the territory's future. Weiss listened without interrupting. He had a quality of stillness when he was thinking that I had observed in maybe 3 people across 2 lifetimes. He sat in the camp room with a cup I had not seen him drink from, and he listened while I described the Tegun Mountain, the terrain, the natural fortification of the geography, and the proposal I had been constructing for 4 months. A pioneer settlement at the foot of the mountain, structured around the mercenary company as its security backbone, with regular contract income and peacetime employment for the men. "You want us to stop being mercenaries?" Weiss said when I finished. "I want you to have steady work," I said. "The mercenary market in this region is going to get worse before it gets better. Gorman will not be in a position to hire anyone for years. I want you to have a contract that does not depend on whoever won last month's border skirmish." He looked at me for a moment. "You are 10 years old." Not as an insult. As a fact, he was apparently still processing. "I know. I will not be governing the settlement until 15. Raymond will manage the administration. My mother has already agreed to the terms. I need your answer." He was quiet for another moment. "I will hear what the steward proposes," he said, which was the same answer he had given at the soup kitchen. He was a man who delayed his decisions until he had more information, which I respected enormously because it meant his decisions, once made, were final. Raymond handled the rest of that negotiation with the precision of a man who had been preparing for it since approximately the day he assigned Anne to watch me. The harder conversation was with my father. My father was not a fool. He had survived 12 years of frontier lordship and a border war, and he had opinions about expenditure that were formed in specific and expensive circumstances. He sat across from me in the receiving room, and he looked at the proposal Raymond had written up, and he said that it was an outrageous idea for an outrageous amount of money. My mother was sitting 2 seats to his left. "The profit from the wheat trading," she said, in the tone of a woman who has been waiting to say this for a specific length of time, "came from Tail's proposals, the relief system, the granaries, the noodles, the water wheels." She smiled. "This is not outrageous money, dear. This is a return on investment." My father looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at the table. "The budget decision is separate from the flood control project," Raymond said. "Of course." My father conceded with the expression of a man who had been outflanked by his own household and had decided to treat it as a lesson. "I received 1,000 gold in conditional budget and 500 gold in freely usable funds. The settlement went forward. Weiss's mercenary company, 40 men now, because he had quietly recruited a dozen during the campaign months, signed the contract and moved their base to Tegun. The compound crossbow took longer to explain. I had been building it for 3 years with Carl's help in the back section of Gerd's workshop behind a partitioned wall, and a standing agreement that questions about the specific pulley mechanism would be answered with nothing. The theory was Japanese. The implementation was Carl's, because Carl had the hands for it and the specific instinct of a craftsman who understood what a design was trying to accomplish and improved it without being asked. The result could drive a bolt through iron plate at 40 paces. I brought it to the training ground and handed it to Weiss. He looked at it. He looked at it the way he looked at everything tactical, with the specific attention of a man who was already counting the ways to use it. Then he fired it. The bolt hit the metal target and went through. "With equipment like this," he said, "I can destroy Graphonia's iron cavalry." He said it the way you state a conclusion you have already reached, not as a boast, as a logistical observation. "I know," I said. The proposal that came next was already prepared. Mass production, with the pulley mechanism kept confidential. Only our soldiers would have this version. A shooting gallery open to the public as entertainment, with annual competitions and prizes that would identify the best archers without us having to look for them. 3-team rotation for continuous fire. 1 team shooting, 1 reloading, 1 passing arrows, cycling every few seconds. And Weiss would receive a pre-production run in exchange for field testing and training duty. My father did not receive this proposal as calmly. He received it the way he received every proposal from me that involved weapons and secrecy, with an expression that suggested he was deciding between pride and alarm and had not quite chosen. "You should have reported this to me first," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "I'm sorry. I wanted Weiss's assessment first, so I had an expert opinion when you asked whether it actually worked." This was partially true. The rest of the truth was that I had needed to know Weiss's reaction before my father's, because Weiss's reaction told me whether the tactical picture I had built in my head matched the tactical picture a real commander saw in the field. It did. That was important. We presented it together, Darek and I, in the courtyard, with a metal plate set up at distance. Darek had practiced the day before. He hit it clean, and my mother very quietly murmured something about the expense. Raymond asked the correct question, which was what we planned to do about the crossbow's reload time compared to a standard bow. I held up 3 fingers. "That is why there are 3 teams." He smiled. He wrote it down. The shooting gallery proposal went forward. Gerd's workshop expanded again. Workers tripled. Metalwork outsourced to the blacksmiths. Division of labor for the first time in a carpenter's operation. Carl became head of production. The Estol bow, as it would eventually be called, was classified to our forces and our allies alone. Then came the question about Darek. We were 3 months out from the border war that had killed him in the original timeline. I had been watching his sword training with the specific attention of a man who was trying to figure out how to keep his brother alive without explaining that he knew his brother was going to die. Darek was advancing faster than the book said he would. The light magic had manifested early, which I had not predicted, which meant I was already off script from the history. The light magic looked like a problem until I sat with it for a week. Darek demonstrated it for Weiss and me on a Thursday morning. He spread his hands, and a bright pulse of white light snapped out from his palms. bombs, enough to make your eyes water at range. He looked at it with the expression of a boy who had been given a gift he could not use. I cannot attack with it, he said. It only blinds. It is useless in a real fight. What happens? I said. If you fire that in front of a charging horse? Weiss went very still. Darek turned to look at me. The horse would startle. A horse is a prey animal, I said. A horse that is blinded and startled at a full gallop will not stop. It will not turn. It will fall. Weiss smiled. It was not a comfortable smile. It was the specific smile of a man who had just understood how to end a battle before it started. How many horses does the Goth border baron's iron cavalry run? He asked. Not to me, to the air. 2,000, I said. Give or take. He looked at me with the expression I had been waiting for, not the pleasant assessment I had been getting since the soup kitchen, but the specific, undivided attention of a man who had just understood what kind of person he was working for. Tell me, he said, when you imagine the ideal outcome of the battle next year, what does it look like? I told him. He spent 3 days redesigning the trench system. The Battle of the Southern Gate came in a summer that smelled like hot iron and dry grass. Gort Border Count was a confident commander with 2,000 iron cavalry and the specific overconfidence of a man who had never faced an army that had prepared for him specifically. He surveyed our formation from the hill and saw what he was supposed to see: a crane wing deployment, an isolated small unit on the far right, a chance to break the right flank with overwhelming cavalry and then roll up the center. He saw a sheep and he sent his wolves at it. What he did not see was the trenches. What he did not see were the 400 Estol bow archers hidden behind the barriers, already aimed at sectors 2 through 5 from the right edge. What he did not see was a 10-year-old boy who had spent 3 years building the conditions for this exact moment, standing on that hill with his family's steward and his executioner turned general, watching the iron cavalry begin to move. Right to direction, Weiss said. Now, Darek fired. The flash was brilliant and sudden and absolute. 2,000 horses experienced something their prey animal brains had no category for. Light where there should be ground. Light in the eyes at full gallop. The world going white in the moment when you cannot stop. And they fell. The first volley was 1,200 arrows. The second volley came before the cavalry could regroup. The third came as they reached the trench line and piled up against it, and the Estol bows cut them down in sections. 3-team rotation, cycling without pause. Men passing arrows forward while other men shot. The whole system working exactly as I had described it in a proposal 2 years ago in a receiving room where my father had looked at me with the expression of a man choosing between pride and alarm. Weiss led the cavalry encirclement after the fourth volley. He left a gap in the circle deliberately because a surrounded enemy fights harder than a routed one, and he wanted them routing. 2,000 iron cavalry entered that valley. Under 400 came out. In the original history, Solus had lost 40% of its forces in this border war. In this history, we lost no one. Afterward, I sat on a hill and watched Weiss direct the cleanup with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times before, and I understood something I had been turning over in my mind since the soup kitchen. I had been afraid of him. I was still afraid of him, in the specific way you are afraid of something that is also true. But what I had watched today was not the man who burned me alive. What I had watched was what that man became when he was pointed at the right enemy at the right time. The skill that killed me in one timeline had just saved everyone around me in this one. I was not sure what to do with that. I did not have a category for it. The barony received 8,000 gold and 300 warhorses. Darek received 500 gold and a baronet's title. He was 12 years old, and he stood in the aftermath of his first battle with the expression of a boy who has discovered that the thing he feared would destroy him was actually the thing he was made for. My mother embraced him when we returned. My father stood beside her, looking slightly surplus to requirements. Anne, standing 3 paces back, as was her habit, looked at the scene and then looked at me, and I think something about my face told her something about mine, because she said nothing, which was the right thing. Raymond found me the next morning. He stood in the doorway of the planning room, not the receiving room, the planning room, the one nobody else used, and he looked at me with the expression I had been expecting from him for 4 years. The expression of a man who had recognized a card trick and had finally decided to say so. Takhil-sama, he said, I have something I wish to tell you, in confidence. He closed the door behind him. He had space-time magic, specifically spatial detection, the ability to read, on an invisible map only he could see, whether each person he was looking at was an ally, an enemy, or neutral. He had hidden it his entire life, because a commoner with useful magic in this kingdom ended up in service to someone who did not ask and did not say please. He had hidden it so well that even my mother, who had been his employer for 15 years, did not know. He had been using it for me the entire time. Every village meeting, every negotiation, every proposal he had carried into rooms that needed adult authority. He had known, from that invisible map, whether the room was safe. He had known Anne was loyal before she knew it herself. He had known about Gorman's hostility when it was still below the visible surface. "I do not know how you know what you know," Raymond said. "I have not asked because you have not offered, and because whatever the answer is, it has kept this territory alive." He looked at me with the precise attention I had been aware of since I was 3 years old. "I would like to offer my support directly, not through intermediaries. You are 12 years old, and you have more planning to do, and you do not need to do it alone." I thought about that for a moment. It was not how I had imagined this conversation. I had imagined something more confrontational, more interrogative. I had prepared, in the back of my head, a version of this where I had to deflect harder and give less away. The flood. It comes in 14 months. The Olg River. I need earthwork mages in Marstown before the summer rains. He did not blink. He reached for his ledger. "I have already sent a message to your mother's brother," he said. "The mages will arrive in spring." He looked up. "What else?" "The border war that should have killed my brother was 2 years out, not 4. The book had it at 13. Darek killed in a border engagement before the plague. I had moved Vice's employment, built the crossbow corps, invented the light cavalry tactic with Darek's own magic, and staged the battle with prepared terrain and 3-team rotation. The battle came in early spring when Darek was 12. The iron cavalry came, the light magic and the arrows, and Vice's encirclement worked exactly as designed. We received 8,000 gold and 300 warhorses. Darek received 500 gold and a baronet's title. He was 12 years old, and he stood in the aftermath of his first battle with the expression of a boy who has discovered that the thing he feared would destroy him was actually the thing he was made for. Raymond's invisible map had told us that morning that there was no spy in the Allied formation. This was the first operational use of his detection in active combat conditions, and it confirmed what I had been hoping it would confirm, that the Allied position was clean, that the men I was relying on were genuinely on our side, that the plan was not being fed to the other side through someone I could not see. I had needed to know that. I had not told Raymond I needed to know it. He had offered the information as a matter of course. In the flat professional way, he offered everything, because he had already understood what the relevant concern was. 2 disasters down, 3 on the list. The plague was 6 years away. The famine was 9. The Griffonia invasion. I had just made much harder by removing the general who was supposed to lead it. The book had stopped being a reliable guide. I had changed too much, but I had Raymond and Weiss, and a brother who was alive and still becoming the person the book had said he would be by a different road. And I had, somewhere in the last 2 years, stopped doing everything alone without entirely meaning to. That would have to be enough. The flood came in the 14th month after Weiss signed his contract, exactly when the book said it would. I was standing in the courtyard of the manor at 2 in the morning when the watch riders came in from the Olg River with the news that the water was over the banks. My mother was already awake. She had been awake for 3 hours, her earth magic reading the water pressure through the soil the way other people listen for thunder, and she was moving before the riders finished their report. Every water wheel, every sluice gate, every diversion channel that Alon and Mary had spent 6 weeks reinforcing with their earth magic, working alongside the flood control crews in shifts. Every raised floor granary that a village chief had once tried to talk us out of because it was inconvenient. The Mars town granaries held, the grain belt held, the lower fields flooded as they always do, as the book said they would, but nothing the water touched that night was irreplaceable. The people had evacuated 2 days earlier when my mother's land reading said the pressure was building past the safe threshold. Darek and I managed the emergency food and shelter from the shooting gallery building, which was large enough to serve as a command post and was sitting on the only raised ground in the eastern quarter. By morning, the water was receding. I sat on the outer wall in the gray light, and I felt something that took me several minutes to identify. I had prevented 2 disasters before this, the border war and the early drought, but those were things I had deflected rather than survived. This was different. The flood had come as scheduled, hit the prepared banks, found the reinforced granaries, found the raised floor storage that 2 years of arguing with village chiefs had built, and passed through without taking anything. 3 years of preparation had run up against exactly the disaster they were built for, and the disaster had lost. I had not lost anything in this world that I was supposed to keep. That was the first time in 2 lifetimes I could say that. Then I turned 10, made a note of it in my head, and got back to work. The shooting gallery opened that spring. I used the 1,500 gold in seed money that my parents had given me after the battle, built the first range on the old refugee campgrounds near Est's eastern gate, and hired the people who knew it already: former relief workers, orphanage graduates, anyone who had come through the registration office and proven themselves competent under pressure. Claire managed the reception from the first week. She was 13 years old, and she handled the daily intake numbers with the focus of a woman twice her age. And when she came to me 3 months after opening to suggest that we had enough data to start a monthly tournament, she presented it with a written analysis of the registration figures that Raymond read twice before writing, "Hire her for everything," in the margin. I did not tell Claire why I had hired her from the orphanage specifically. I knew her name before she introduced herself. I knew her face from a courtyard in my first life. A cold morning, 5 women kneeling in the mud, a girl whose voice I remembered saying that I had shared the famine alongside them. The book recorded her. My memory held her. She was 13 years old in this life, and she did not know me at all, and I was going to spend the next several years giving her every resource and opportunity I could arrange, without explaining why, which was the specific awkwardness of being a dead man trying to repay a debt to people who had not yet made it. The mage recruitment ran through the same pipeline. The shooting range gave me registration data on every person who came through the gates: name, age, occupation, which events they competed in, how their numbers looked when they were excited versus calm. The book, cross-referenced with 10 years of future population records, gave me a list of 200 names to check against that data. I narrowed it to 50 who were the right age, in the right location, and had not been carried off by disasters my changes had already prevented. I found 10 of them. Christoph was first, a hunter's son with wind magic talent who thought his ability to hit moving targets was simply instinct. Carleen was second, same elemental affinity, same instinctive precision with moving targets that Wayne sensitivity gave her. I told them both in private, the day after the tournament, where Carleen placed 9th and spent the next 3 months quietly becoming someone who could never place 9th again. I told them what I suspected, what the ceremony would confirm, and what it meant if I was right. Christoph looked at me in the specific way someone looks at you when they have just been told something that rearranges the last 15 years of their life. Carleen cried. Then she apologized for crying. Then she asked when she could start. Claire's ceremony came later, quietly, away from the others. She already knew something was different about herself. Fire magic is not subtle when it wants out, but she had been suppressing it since childhood, with the specific determination of a girl who has spent her life being careful not to cause problems. When the ceremony confirmed it, she cried differently than Carleen. She cried like someone who had been very tired for a very long time and had just been told they could put something down. "I can finally repay you." "You already have," I said. "You have been running the entire tournament operation for 4 months. You are 13. She looked at me with the expression of someone who does not entirely believe that, and I did not push it, because some things you have to let people decide for themselves. By the end of the following year, I had 10 mages: fire, wind, earth, water, holy, and 1 space-time, Bart, who had the specific magic affinity that runs in bloodlines connected to time and space, and who had been working as a committee assistant with the steady, reliable competence of someone who had never been given something to be competent with before. 10 mages from a territory of 8,000 people. My father had calculated the statistical odds at roughly 1 in 5,000 and concluded I would find 1 or 2 at best. I did not tell him about the book. I staged 1 deliberate failure in the testing ceremony series because 10 consecutive successes would have been suspicious, and my father was already looking at me the way Raymond had been looking at me for years. He gave me full discretion over the magic core after the 10th confirmation. He said, "Do as you please," in the tone of a man who has given up trying to understand what he is looking at. My mother said, "Thank you, truly." The Solus Magic Corps was the 3rd elite force of the territory, after the Archer Corps and the Cavalry. It was also the most secret. Only Gale and Gold trained publicly with the Standing Army. The rest remained as staff, receptionists, committee assistants, and workshop helpers, building their skills in private, under Weiss's training twice a week, becoming something that would not look like what it was until it needed to. The survey trip to Tegun took 4 days. I had been wanting to make this trip for 3 years. Tegun was Weiss's base now, 200 settlers, a growing wall, the beginnings of something that could become what I needed it to be, and I had plans for it that required seeing the geography in person rather than from memory. I brought Raymond and Anne, and the 10 mages, and my brother and Weiss. On the 4th day, coming back from the edge of the great forest, which smelled of bamboo and old magic and something I could not name, and which Weiss's men patrolled in rotations because you did not want to let it grow toward the road, I asked for a rest stop. Nobody questioned this. I had an 11-year-old's body that had been walking survey routes for 4 days, and nobody thought it unusual that I wanted to sit down. I led Raymond and 3 others into a ravine 15 minutes from the road. There was a cliff face at the end of it. The stripes in the rock were red-brown against gray, the specific pattern of banded iron formation that a salaryman who had once spent 3 weeks reading about mining economics for a work project and had apparently committed more of it to memory than he realized. I stood in front of the cliff, and I did not have to say anything. Raymond looked at the rock. He looked at me. He had the expression of a man who has been watching a card trick for 6 years and has just seen the final reveal. "The book," I said, "recorded that this mine was discovered 6 years after the plague, after my family died, after the famine, after everything." I picked up a piece of loose rock from the ground. The iron content was obvious in the weight of it. "I have just discovered it 6 years early. This is the collateral for the investment we need from Margrave Habsburg to fund the fortress build." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Understood," he said. He reached for his ledger and opened it to a blank page. "What is the access road situation?" We spent the next hour planning the mine survey. The mages were called in. Sarah identified 3 water veins that could be diverted for ore processing. Alon mapped the geological strata in a way that took me 3 explanations to follow and 1 moment to understand. We were standing on top of enough iron ore to fund the fortress city, the mage corps, and the border wall expansion, and we had found it 6 years before anyone else would have thought to look here. Back at the camp that evening, I presented Misery with the full city plans. She had been running Taegun as acting governor for a year. She was 19 years old, and she managed the settler logistics with the precision of someone who had been doing it for a decade. I had known her name before I arrived, the same way I knew Claire's name, the same way I had known Weiss's name at the soup kitchen, because she had been one of the 5 women kneeling in the mud the first time I died. She had said she knew I had desperately tried to restore the crumbling land for the people's sake. She had said it in the voice of a woman who had been keeping accounts for a lord who could not afford them and had chosen to call that love instead of futility. She was 19 and she had never met me before this trip. I said her name before she introduced herself. The pause that followed was brief but specific. I covered it with something about the mercenary group's logistical reports. Her name had come up in them naturally, and she accepted this the way competent people accept unconvincing explanations when they have too much work to do to pursue it. She filed it away. I could see her filing it. The city plans were 40 pages. They outlined a fortress town of 10,000 residents, positioned at the mountain's natural choke point with sewer infrastructure, a mage defense line, an inner wall and outer wall, market districts, grain storage at 2 levels, an inn district for traveler income, and the iron mine as its financial backbone. She read them in silence for a very long time. "This is a city," she said finally. "That is the plan. You are 12 years old. 11, actually. I'll be 12 in 3 months." She looked at me with the expression I would come to recognize as Misery's specific form of assessment. Not skepticism, not admiration, but the particular focus of a person who is deciding what category something belongs in. She did not ask how. She asked what she needed to do first. Raymond, standing behind me, said nothing, but he had the expression of a man who had just watched a card trick he had already seen performed correctly for the 4th time and had decided that he was no longer surprised and was simply satisfied. That was how it worked in this phase of things. Not explosions and battles, but surveys and plans, and a mine discovered 6 years early, and a woman handed a blueprint for a city and asking what she needed to do first. 3 disasters down, 2 on the list. The plague was 5 years away. The invasion was 8. The book was almost useless now, but I had 10 mages and an iron mine, and Misery, with her 40 pages, and her question about what she needed to do first. I thought that might be enough to work with. I presented the iron mine to Border Count Hallsberg on a Tuesday morning in the outer meeting room of the fortress at Southern Gate, with a sample of ore in my left hand and the full development proposal written by Raymond on the table between us. He was a large man with the specific patience of someone who has spent 20 years at a frontier border and learned that almost nothing is as urgent as it looks. He picked up the ore sample and turned it over. He weighed it in his palm. He looked at me. I was 13 years old, and I had spent 2 weeks rehearsing this conversation. And then he looked at Weiss, who was standing behind me with his arms folded, and the specific expression he used when he found something darkly amusing. "How did you find it?" Hallsberg asked. "Survey trip," I said. He did not press this. I had the impression he had already decided before I arrived, because the proposal Raymond had sent ahead contained a geological analysis by a qualified earth mage, a water flow survey by a certified water mage, and a 10-year repayment structure that included interest at the rate the border count himself had paid on his last treasury loan. The offer was structured to be more attractive than any alternative he could find elsewhere, because I had spent 6 months making sure it was. 10,000 official. He turned the ore sample over once more. And another 10,000 personal. No interest. No repayment schedule. I said thank you. He told me that when the development succeeded, he would consider granting me the baronet title, same as my brother. He also asked, with the specific tone of a man who already knew the answer, whether the Estol Beo I had brought as a diplomatic gift was the one his cavalry commander had been trying to reverse engineer from the Southern Gate battlefield reports for 2 years. I told him it was the same basic design. Yes. He laughed. It was a real laugh. I walked out of that meeting with 20,000 gold in commitment and a promise that my father would have to be talked into believing. The family council was harder. My father had spent 15 years as a frontier baron, and he had opinions about debt. He looked at the terms Raymond had laid out, and he set conditions. Minimum 10,000 gold secured. Already done. 60 soldiers deployable from Taegun in 5 years. 110. All new mages' salaries borne by Taegun's revenues and not the barony's budget. And a personal repayment guarantee that would have made any reasonable man hesitate. I accepted everything. Then I added my own condition. When the next military campaign occurs, I said, I will serve as a soldier in the mobilized force under your command. The room went quiet. My mother glared at my father with the specific expression she used when she had concluded that something was his fault. Raymond looked at the table. Darek suppressed a laugh badly enough that the suppression was louder than the laugh would have been. My sister looked confused. My father went pale. He was imagining, I think, a version of this conversation where he had won. He had set conditions he believed were strict enough to slow me down. I had accepted them in approximately 4 seconds and immediately made the stakes of the negotiation into something entirely different. Agreed, he said, in a voice that had misplaced something. Ground was broken on Taegun within the week. The next 2 years were the most expensive thing I had ever done, including dying. The fortress walls went up first, 20 meters, stone facing over earthwork fill, with the inner layer including the concealed archer positions that Christoph and Weiss had designed together. The outer ditch doubled as an irrigation reservoir, which was Elon's idea, and which saved enough water in the summer months to make the difference between a functional harvest and an anxious one. The hospital went up in Sector 3, staffed partly from Est and partly from the clinic network I had been building for 3 years. The orphanage took the upper quarter, attached to the school, because children in frontier settlements do not have the luxury of being children exclusively. Misery managed the accounts through all of this with the composure of a woman who has accepted that composure is the only viable response to near bankruptcy. She produced weekly reports that described, in precise and formal language, how close we were to running out of gold. She never panicked in the reports. Privately, she told me twice that we were approximately 1 bad ore delivery away from having to stop construction entirely. We were not 1 bad ore delivery away because Bart's space-time storage magic meant the transport costs from the mine to the processing facility were effectively 0, and because my mother had quietly arranged a grain for iron exchange with 3 neighboring baronies that produced more consistent revenue than any commercial sale. These were not things I had planned for. They were the specific competence of the people around me, filling in the gaps I had not thought to fill. This was also new in my experience. The shooting gallery graduated 400 militia archers over those 2 years. They were miners, merchants, farmers, and teenagers. They had trained for 2 years with the Estol bow and the Juga, repeating crossbow under the rotating instruction of Weiss's mercenaries. They knew how to hold formation on the walls. They knew the fire signals. They knew which man had the horn and which positions covered the gate approach from above. What they did not know was how to fight in an open field against trained cavalry, but I had not built them for open fields. Hyorami's second son Errol arrived at the Taegun Gate with 200 soldiers in the late afternoon, 3 days after a bandit raid we had just finished cleaning up from. He said he had heard about the attack and had come to help. The timing was the specific kind of coincidence that is not a coincidence at all, and Misery's intelligence report, she had been collecting information from the settlement registrations with the focused patience of a woman who had decided that understanding what was happening was her job, had already told us the bandits had known about our development fund in ways only a few nobles could have. I rode out to meet him alone. This was not bravery, it was staging. Errol laid out his proposal with the confidence of someone who had planned it carefully. We were undermanned. The attack had clearly demonstrated our vulnerability, and Hyorami's forces would be happy to provide protection and management of the development in exchange for a share of the mine output and administrative oversight of the town. Thank you, I said, but the bandits have already been handled. Then I waved the red flag. 400 archers stood up on the walls. Errol's eyes moved along the wall line. He was counting. 200 soldiers versus 400 bows at range, from prepared positions, behind 20-meter walls, with a narrow gate approach that funneled cavalry into a killing ground. He counted, and he recalculated. He had not planned for this. I told him that our Estol bows could penetrate armor at 300 meters. Christoph demonstrated from the wall by putting a bolt through a practice target at that distance, with what looked like no particular effort. Carleen added wind magic guidance to the next shot, so it curved slightly around an obstacle, which was technically showing off, but the look on Errol's face was worth the admission. I mentioned that 100 iron cavalry were on their way as reinforcements. This was a lie. The iron cavalry were in Est, which was a day's ride away, but Errol did not know that, and he was a man doing arithmetic in real time, and the arithmetic was not going his way. He left. Later, when Weiss returned and I told him about it, he laughed for the first time I had ever seen him laugh. Not the dangerous smile, not the dry acknowledgement, but an actual laugh. The kind that goes somewhere you did not plan to go and keeps arriving after you thought it was done. I wanted to show you the look on his face, I said. You will show me the next one. They will come back. He was right. He was always right about things like that, but they did not come back that season. And the Harvest Festival proceeded on a 2-day delay, and the militia got their bonuses and their free bread from Frantown. And Misery wrote a report that was, for the first time in 8 months, not about how close we were to running out of money. Krisha found the brothel on the second day of her first visit. She was 10 years old, and she had arrived with the specific energy of a child who has been told no several times and has decided to go anyway. And she had spent the first day being delighted by everything, and the second day investigating what was in the third building from the southern gate that had drawn such a specific traffic pattern during her first day's observations. I was in the planning room when she came to find me. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and a very specific expression. She was Solus family, which meant she had her mother's instinct for the weight of a moment and her father's instinct for the economic implications, and she had 10 years of experience watching her older brothers negotiate with each other and their parents, and she had extracted the lessons from all of it. I want a magic test, she said. I looked at her. She looked at me. I haven't told anyone anything, she added. I thought about this for a moment. The practical necessity of the brothel in a settlement that was 80% male was something I had thought through carefully and had not enjoyed thinking through. It was the kind of decision that falls off the edge of the idealized version of how you want to build things. And it had been Misery who had raised it, and I had agreed with her assessment, and we had done it properly, licensed, regulated, wages and workers' rights written into the settlement charter, and I had been hoping my parents would not visit. The test can be arranged. What you found stays between us. She unfolded her arms. The expression shifted to something I recognized as the specific satisfaction of a 10-year-old who has just won a negotiation. The ceremony was quiet. The results were not. Dual affinity, fire and holy. Dual affinity is rare, 1 in several thousand. The holy component was the specific gap I had been trying to fill in the medical corps since the plague prevention planning began 3 years ago. Rosa was our only holy mage, and she could not be in 2 places at once. The fire component was supplementary, but the combination, in a family bloodline that ran on earth magic through my mother and space-time magic through my father, was something the ceremony examiner said he had not seen in 15 years of conducting tests. Krisha looked at her hands, the way people look at things that have always been there and have just been named. You have to train, I said, quietly, with Rosa and the others. This does not become public. I know, she said, in the tone of a 10-year-old who is enjoying having a secret with her older brother more than she is showing. And what you found in the 3rd district? She tilted her head. What 3rd district? She was 10 years old, and she had her mother's smile. I recognized it at the exact moment she produced it. I found, to my genuine surprise, that I had missed her. The plague was 3 years out now. The hospital was staffed. Krisha was training. The fortress walls were up, and the militia had held their formation under real pressure, and the visiting noble had counted 400 bows and left without engaging. The mine was producing, and the debt was being serviced, and Misery's reports had started describing progress rather than proximity to disaster. 2 disasters down from the original 5. 3 survived with 0 deaths. The book was almost silent. Whatever came next was almost entirely original timeline, which meant almost entirely uncharted. The last item on the original list was the Griffonia invasion, and I had already changed the conditions enough that the original plan would not arrive in the original form. What would arrive was something I could not fully predict, but I had the walls and the mages and Weiss and Krisha's smile and her holy magic and her very specific willingness to keep a secret. That was the inventory. It would have to be enough. There is a specific quality to the silence before a war that I had never experienced in my Japanese life and had tried very hard to prevent in this one. We did not prevent the war. We prevented the war going badly. That is a different thing, and the distance between those 2 outcomes is measured in 52 names. The first Prince of Griffonia crossed the border with 28,000 soldiers in the early spring of the year I turned 15. He had been pushed toward this by a brother's political maneuvering, by the specific opportunity of a Kyle kingdom that had just recalled its knight's order to the capital for a ceremonial review, and by the promise of a flanking route that a trader's 3 gold coins had offered to map for him. I had been watching for this since I was 3 years old, with a book on my lap and a crib around me. In the week before the main engagement, the preparations ran exactly as designed, which was its own particular kind of pressure. I had the experience, across 2 lifetimes, of plans that did not run as designed, and I had learned to trust preparation. But the preparation becoming real is different from the preparation being theoretical, and there is a specific moment when you look at the Mage Corps arrayed at their positions, and the Estol bow battalions on the hill, and the earthwork trenches Alon's team had spent 3 months building, and you understand that this is not a drill anymore. The morning of the main engagement, I woke before dawn. I sat in the commander's tent for about 20 minutes without moving. Then Anne brought tea without being asked, and sat across from me, and also did not speak. We had been doing things like this since I was 10 years old. The specific companionship of 2 people who are both thinking hard about the same problem from slightly different angles, and have learned that silence is sometimes more useful than conversation. I said, eventually, the corridor holds, the main valley holds. We stop the pursuit when Astray's cavalry appears on the flank. Those are the 3 decision points. Yes, I set down my cup. If the corridor does not hold, Claire and Christophe trained for this scenario for 2 years, she said. They will hold it. I said nothing. You are allowed to be afraid of losing them. I was. I had not said it, not even to myself, but I was afraid of losing them. Christophe, who had come second at the first tournament and would have joined Vice's mercenaries if I had not seen his wind magic potential and offered him something else, and Claire, who had been in my reception office at 13 and was now standing in a mountain corridor ready to give an order that would kill 2,000 people. I had built the system that put them there, and I was afraid. Anne looked at the 10 entrants. They chose to be there. I know. That is what makes it bearable, she said, and also what makes it hard. That was the conversation. We rode to the battle line shortly after. The first Prince of Griffonia crossed the border with 28,000 soldiers in the early spring of the year I turned 15. He had been pushed toward this by a brother's political maneuvering, by the specific opportunity of a Kyle kingdom that had just recalled its knight's order to the capital for a ceremonial review, and by the promise of a flanking route that a trader's 3 gold coins had offered to map for him. I had been watching for this since I was 3 years old, with a book on my lap and a crib around me. The flanking route ran through the northern mountain pass, the one Weiss had described to me in the dirt map at the soup kitchen when I was 10 and he was 21, and neither of us had named what we were actually talking about. The pass that I had built Taegun specifically to defend, that I had positioned 11 mages in forward positions to hold, that I had spent 6 months engineering approach conditions to ensure the main Imperial force could not use without crossing through the valley between the southern gate hills, where the Demon Realm's monster corridor ran twice a year like a seasonal tide. I had done everything I could think to do. On the morning of the main engagement, I rode to the battle line with my father and Weiss and 200 cavalry from the Solus barony, and I was 15 years old, and my sword had never been used in anything but practice, and I was thinking about Christophe and Claire. They were in the pass, 11 mages against 3,000 soldiers. The plan was to hold them there, reduce their strength, and send them back across the border before they reached the main engagement zone. I had designed the plan. I had rehearsed it with Weiss and Christophe for 2 years. I had built the terrain features, the gate, the ditch, the observation platform carved from the cliff by Elan's earth magic, the concealed crossbow positions at mid and long range. Every element was deliberate. I still spent the ride to the battle line doing the math in my head and not finding anything I had missed, which was the specific anxiety of a man who has planned everything and knows that plans exist until contact with the enemy. Contact happened at dawn. In the pass, it happened with fire. The flanking force had 3 bandits as guides and a marquis commanding. The marquis was an honorable man by the lights of his culture, which meant he executed the guides when they had served their purpose and led his soldiers into a prepared kill zone without knowing that was what it was. Christophe gave the signal from the observation platform when the flanking force had committed past the point of easy retreat in the narrowest section of the corridor, with the constructed gate ahead and the collapsed bridge behind. He gave the signal calmly, the way Weiss gives orders, because a signal given in panic produces responses given in panic, and what happened next required precision. Claire gave the order for fire, 11 mages. 3,000 soldiers in a corridor 10 meters wide. Fire magic in an enclosed space operates on the physics of an oven. The air itself becomes part of the weapon. The walls reflect the heat. The floor channels it upward. A fire mage in open ground creates a column of flame. A fire mage in a closed corridor creates something closer to a combustion event. Christophe later told me that the screaming lasted about 4 minutes and then stopped entirely. I did not ask him what happened after the screaming stopped. Some things you absorb through the fact of them without needing the specifics. The flanking force lost 70% of its strength in the corridor. The survivors who reached the gate found 400 archers waiting and water walls building in the moat above. When the gate opened and the snowmelt came down the slope, the survivors who had been planning to climb found that water at that volume and speed has a specific relationship with armor that the marquis had not briefed his soldiers on. The marquis was shot by Christophe while ordering a retreat. The pass held. In Tegun itself, which I learned about through Misery's letter 3 weeks later, written in her characteristic precision, the situation had been managed by Claire and Christophe from the start. A flanking force of 3,000 had arrived at the gate, found 400 militia archers on the walls, and Misery reading a letter from me aloud in the town square, and determined after surveying the defensive arrangement that the engagement was not going to produce the result they needed. The letter, which I had written before the campaign began, described the garrison as a distraction force and told the townspeople exactly what they needed to hear to hold formation without breaking. Claire's fire magic, visible to anyone watching the gate approach, completed the picture. The gate did not fall. Misery, in her letter, noted that she had found the letter very irritating because I had clearly written it knowing the attack was coming and had not thought to mention this to anyone in Tegun prior to leaving. She was correct. I added it to the list of things I would apologize for later. In the main valley, the battle followed the shape I had prepared for it. The Imperial Army's cavalry charge hit the Kyle earthwork line and stalled. The Estol bow battalions opened from the hill positions. The light magic tactic, which had been designed for 1,000 horses and which Darek executed for 8,000, produced what it produces. Horses falling in a front line that collapses inward. A cavalry charge converting from momentum into chaos. The specific tactical vulnerability of heavy cavalry when they cannot move. I should say something about Derek here, because watching him in that engagement, and I watched him from the eastern ridge through a borrowed distance scope that Bart had sourced from a coastal merchant 2 years earlier, was one of the specific moments of this life that I have carried forward intact, rather than in summary. He was 16 years old. He had been training under Weiss for 5 years. His light magic had been useless until I asked the right question at 10, and in the intervening years, he had developed it into something that could, at 8,000 meters of frontal approach, blind an entire cavalry column simultaneously. The technique required him to be visible, standing on the ridgeline, not concealed, a target for any archer with range. He stood there with the specific stillness of his mother's decision-making, unhurried, while 8,000 horses came toward the ridge at full gallop, and he fired at the exact moment Weiss had calculated, and then he did not move. The horses fell. 3 volleys of 1,200 arrows each followed, while the cavalry was broken. The Griffonia Iron Cavalry, the force that had devastated every previous engagement it had entered, lost 90% of its combat capacity in 40 minutes. Then, Weiss led the encirclement. He had been waiting. He had positioned 200 cavalry on the western ridgeline before dawn, and he had spent the morning watching and waiting. And when the light magic volley broke the charge, he moved with the precision of a man who has done this before and knows exactly the window between breaking the charge and the enemy recovering enough to establish a defensive line. The encirclement took 40 minutes. The pursuit was halted by Weiss himself. He came to my father and me on the eastern ridge and said, in the tone of a man delivering information rather than making a recommendation, that a commander called Count Astre had brought 2,000 fresh cavalry around the flank and was running interference on the Kyle advance. If we push into him, we take casualties we don't need to take, Weiss said. The battle is decided. My father looked at me. I looked at the valley below, at the broken cavalry, the firewall still burning in the monster corridor approach, the ordered retreat of Astre's force that was protecting its retreating prince rather than pressing for advantage. It was the specific shape of a battle that has been won and knows it. I said, stop the pursuit. Weiss nodded once and went to relay the order. He did not say anything else. That was how he handled decisions he agreed with. The monsters came that night. I need to explain what I mean by this, because the monsters came does not capture what it was. The Demon Realm's corridor, the migration route that the various creatures of the magical borderlands use twice a year, runs directly through the valley where the Griffonia camp sat. I had known this for 3 years. I had mapped it during the Tegun surveys when the corridor ran through our lower fields, and we lost 2 sheep and a storage shed to a wolf pack migration before the perimeter system was in place. I had positioned the Griffonia camp on the corridor, not through force, through engineering approach conditions to eliminate every alternative. The valley camp was what remained after I made every other option slightly worse. The Border Count's earthwork teams, following my specifications, had elevated the approaches on either side and diverted the southern road. The Imperial Army had seen it as a natural defensive position with clear sightlines. It was a natural defensive position with clear sightlines and a seasonal monster corridor running through it. The attack began at 10 at night and continued until 3 in the morning. At least 40 species I had documented in the Tegun borderland surveys. Wolf types and boar types, and the 3-headed variety that paralyzes with its gaze, and things I have no name for in either Japanese or this language. Things that phase through armor and emerge inside it. 4,000 Imperial soldiers were dead by dawn. I am not going to describe it in more detail than this. I designed the conditions that put the army there. I knew the corridor pattern. I chose to engineer their camp onto it rather than warning them away from it. That is the specific moral weight of what I did, and I have carried it without resolving it, because there is no resolution available that changes what I chose and why I chose it. At sunrise, Border Count Hallsberg launched with 10,000 troops. The first Prince Glorious retreated with 9,000 survivors out of 28,000. He lost 2 border counts, 1 marquis, and the better part of his cavalry. The flanking force was effectively gone. The battle that the history book had recorded as the invasion that burned down my family's barony had become a massacre that went entirely the other direction. We called it the Southern Gate Blood Battle. The name was accurate. The cost was 52 soldiers from our side. 52 is not a large number relative to 19,000. I know this. I knew it on the day of the battle when the casualty reports came in, and I knew it in the capital when the king confirmed my baron title and said that my contribution to the defense would be noted in the kingdom's history, and I knew it when I received 10,000 gold in individual reward and 50,000 for Tegun's development. 52 names, and I had placed every one of them where they died. When we marched back through the settlement at Tegun, the townspeople who had held the walls came out to meet us at the road. They had built a flower path, not the elaborate bamboo tube ceremony I would see later in other contexts. Just people who had been frightened and held and had survived standing along the road with whatever they had picked from the late spring fields. It was not organized. It was not the kind of thing you plan. I rode through it with my face as neutral as I could keep it and did not let it land until I was alone. I came back to Tegun 6 weeks later, after the capital ceremony and the war spoils meeting and the formal awards. The second harvest festival was being set up. The victory celebration, the tournament announcement, the welcome party was arranged by Misery, which meant it was organized and warm and offered exactly the food I would have chosen and had not mentioned to anyone. I sat through the meeting about war spoils and promotions and the construction schedule for the Border Knight Order barracks. I approved the prisoner labor assignments and the horse sales. I worked through the tournament announcement panic when everyone realized the facilities did not exist yet, and Anne clapped her hands and told everyone to show their strength, and the room remembered what strength looked like. Then I went to the courtyard behind the manor for the memorial service. It was a brief service. It is always brief when you are honoring people who died, specifically because you sent them to that position. Brief feels appropriate. Brief feels like what you owe them, which is not much in the way of ceremony and is everything in the way of carrying the knowledge forward. I stayed after the service was over. I sat in the courtyard in the afternoon light, and I did not have a plan for what I was doing there. I was sitting with 52 names, and the fact that all the planning in the world produces outcomes, and outcomes include the names of people who were there when the outcome went wrong. There was a young mage on the list. His name was Clan. He had trained with Derek in the sword courses and had developed light magic alongside his own wind affinity, which was unusual enough that Vice had noted it in a training assessment. He had been in the forward position during the Taegun flanking assault. Kristoff said later that Clan had held the eastern watchtower for 3 hours while the main gate engagement was in progress, alone, with a Zhuge crossbow and 20 shots. He had held it. He had also been one of the 52. I had not placed him there specifically, but I had built the system that placed him there, and I had known when I built it that the forward positions would be held by people whose names I might not know until after. I was sitting with that fact when I heard Claire come into the courtyard. I did not hear her. She moved quietly. The specific economy of motion I had noted before she was a mage, before she was anything to me other than a very efficient receptionist, but she was there. I know she was there because she put her arms around me from behind without speaking first, which was not something she would have done a year earlier or 2 years earlier, or in any version of our relationship that was purely professional. She was simply there, holding on. They would want you to smile, she said, eventually. The people you're thinking about, they fought for you. That means they fought for what you're building. They would not want you to stop building. I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, "You saved Misery during the attack. I wasn't going to let anyone touch her. I should have been there. You were at Southern Gate." A pause. "You were supposed to be at Southern Gate." She was crying. I could hear it in the way she held on. She was crying for the same 52 names, and crying for the ones that almost were, and crying for whatever she had seen and done in that mountain pass with the fire and the screaming that lasted 4 minutes. She was 16 years old, and she had given orders that killed 2,000 people, and she was crying in a courtyard with her arms around someone who was not going to tell her that this was simple because it was not simple. We held on to each other for a while. I am not sure how long. Long enough that when Anne appeared in the doorway, she looked at us and then looked at the door and left without speaking, which was the specific competence of a person who understood what was happening and knew that the correct response was not to interrupt it. Anne had been doing things like this since I was 10 years old. I had noticed it more often than I had acknowledged. There was something in the specific decision to leave a room, not to check whether she was needed, not to wait for instructions, but to close the door on someone else's grief and let it be what it was. That was harder to execute than most people understood. The king confirmed my baron title. My father was promoted to viscount. The barony received 60,000 gold between us. Taegun would be built to the next phase. The 52 were memorialized on a stone in the courtyard with their names carved in it, which was something I had proposed and Misery had managed, and which was completed before the festival. I walked past it every morning, not as a discipline. It was simply on the path between the Lord's rooms and the planning room. And every morning, the stone said the same thing. Here are the names of people who died for what you built. Keep building. I put Weiss in charge of the Border Knight Order's branch command and asked him to begin recruitment. He looked at me with the expression that had replaced the dangerous smile, something steadier, something with more weight in it, the expression of a man who has committed to a thing and found the thing to be worth committing to. "I have already started," he said. Of course he had. He had been starting things before I asked him since the soup kitchen. The arrangement worked the same way now as it had then. I trusted him with the outcome. He trusted me with the direction. The years had not changed the structure. They had changed what the structure held. I was 15 years old, and I was a baron, and I had won my first full battle, and I understood, in a way I had not understood at the stake, exactly what victory costs and what it buys, and why neither of those is ever a simple calculation. The book on the shelf in my study had nothing new to say about any of it. The book had run out of disasters around the second year. Everything I was building now, I was building without it. That was fine. I had other things to build with. I saw her on the second day of the Harvest Festival in the central plaza near the market stalls. Long black hair, a way of carrying herself that belonged belonged to someone who had once stood in a merchant's house and then had that house taken away and had been standing differently ever since. Not broken, but careful, the way you stand when you have learned that the floor can disappear. I knew her face. In my first life, in a town square, as the fire was being lit, she had been the last of the 5 to kneel. She had been 17 or 18, and I had not known her name, and she had said something about sharing the famine with me, the lean years, the soup kitchens, the winter relief. She had been the merchant's daughter. I was now standing 15 meters from her in my own town's central plaza, and she was wearing a specific kind of dress that communicated very precisely what she did for a living. I went through the records that night. The merchant Kreis in Est, his grain speculation, the timing of his bankruptcy relative to my grain purchasing campaign during the early years, the preparations I had made before the drought, before the famine, before any of the 5 major disasters. I had purchased in bulk. I had changed the market prices. His speculation had bet on a price movement I had prevented from happening. She was in my brothel because I had saved everyone else. I sent a message to the administrative government the next morning. They contacted the brothel. The brothel said no, not because of money, but because of status. A lord's redemption meant the name of the house over the door, and they wanted that. And a 15-year-old lord's second son sending an administrative envoy did not qualify. They wanted me to come myself, personally, officially, in front of witnesses. I told Anne. Anne's face went through 3 distinct stages: professional assessment, recognition that this was a problem, and then something I could only describe as ice. No, she said. I told misery. Misery produced, with the precision of a woman who had spent 3 years managing near bankruptcies, a detailed analysis of exactly what this would do to my public reputation at 15 years old. I told Claire. Claire looked at me with the expression of someone who very much wanted to help and very much understood why she could not recommend this. I had 3 people in my closest circle telling me I was wrong. They were not wrong. The political calculus was real. A young baron publicly redeeming a prostitute from his own establishment was a specific kind of story that traveled fast, arrived early, and made everything harder. I wrote to my mother, not a status report, not a proposal. I wrote, I have a problem I cannot solve, and I am at my limit, and I need you to come. I wrote about Yol, her name, her situation, what I knew about how she had gotten there, and what my role in it had been. I wrote that I had a secret ability I had never fully explained, that I could sense disaster and magic talent in ways I had never admitted, and that I had been carrying this alone for 15 years, and I was at my limit. I sent the letter. I went to bed. I woke up and went to the planning room and stared at the mine production reports for 3 hours without reading any of them. My mother arrived 4 days later. She had been on the road when the letter reached Est, she told me later, already heading to Tegun for a visit she had been planning since before the battle. The letter just changed the first item on the agenda. She spent half a day walking around Tegun and commenting favorably on the construction. She walked the fortress walls. She visited the hospital and asked Rosa 3 questions about pathogen prevention that Rosa answered with increasing surprise at the precision. She inspected the orphanage school and asked Mia to demonstrate 1 healing casting, watched it carefully, and said it was well controlled for someone her age. She ate lunch at the town square market and spoke with the vendors. Then she sat down across from me in the small inner meeting room and said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything, not everything. I did not tell her about Yuko, or about dying in Japan, or about the specific texture of burning alive in my first life. But I told her about the book. I told her about the disasters and the preparations. I told her about the ability to sense magic talent that I had been using since before I was 7. I told her about the 5 women at the execution, the faces I had been working toward since I was 3 years old and could read the book. I told her about Yol and the grain market and the specific debt I owed a woman I had never met in this life who was in my own town because I had changed things. She listened without interrupting. My mother has always been a person who listens to the end before she speaks, which I had not appreciated until I was old enough to understand how rare that is. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she said she had suspected something like this since I was 5 years old and started building water wheels. "Not the exact mechanism," she said, "but I knew you were not guessing. No one guesses that well for 15 years. And the water wheels, you were 5. You were drawing pulley systems in a carpenter's workshop and explaining to Gerd why your model demonstrated different torque ratios at different gear settings. I asked Raymond what he thought. She smiled. Raymond said you were probably a genius. I thought you were probably something more specific than that. You never said anything. I was waiting for you to be ready, she said, which is different from waiting for you to ask. She told me what she was going to do. The next morning, while I was still organizing my thoughts, while I was sitting in the planning room with the mine production reports that I had not read yesterday and was not going to read today, my mother went to the brothel in the 2nd District, walked in as the Viscountess Solus, produced a document with the family seal, and paid Yoel's debt. She specified the ceremonial requirements, 7 days' notice for formal liberation, per the establishment's protocol, and then she specified additional requirements of her own. Yoel was to be housed in the guest wing of the Lord's mansion beginning immediately, not return to work during the 7 days, and was to be treated as a guest of the house rather than a resident of the establishment. The brothel manager agreed to all of this, because the Viscountess Solus outranked him, and because the specific warmth of her smile when she delivered these requirements left no room for interpretation. She was back in the Lord's mansion by mid-morning. The administrative government had been trying to arrange this for 3 weeks. My mother had handled it between breakfast and mid-morning. I sat with this for a moment. You were 3 steps ahead, I said. I am always 3 steps ahead, she said pleasantly. Now, I need to speak to Anne and Misery and Claire. You will be in the room. You will speak first. Then I will ask you to leave. What will you say to them after I leave? She looked at me with the expression that preceded sentences that changed everything. What needs to be said, she said, which is not something you can plan for. She was right. I accepted this with less grace than I should have and tried not to show it. She gathered them in the small meeting room. She did not have to introduce the topic. They already knew something was happening from the way she had appeared and from the look on my face when she arrived. She told me to speak. I did. The ability, the foreknowledge, the 15 years, the specific guilt about Yoel. Not everything. Enough. Anne's face went through something that took me a moment to identify as pride, not surprise. She had known something was different, but named, confirmed, given a shape, she stood straighter. Misery was shaking. I had never seen Misery shake. She was 21 years old, and she had managed a near-bankrupt fortress city through a war, and she was shaking like the room had moved under her. Claire cried immediately. I was right next to you, she said, the whole time, and I didn't notice. She was not crying because she was sad. She was crying the way people cry when they have been given something they did not realize they had been waiting for, the answer to a question they had stopped asking. She had been beside me through the mountain pass and the memorial service and the courtyard, and she was crying because she understood now why she had put her arms around him in the courtyard and why it had felt like the right thing in a way she could not have explained. They apologized about Yoel, not because they had been wrong about the reputational risk. They had been exactly right about that, but because they understood now what I had known that they hadn't. The debt was not optional. It was mine specifically, and it was real. My mother dismissed me. I found out later, over the course of several days, through the specific observation of 4 people who were suddenly looking at me differently, what she had asked them. She had asked, do you love him? Not, are you loyal to him? Not, do you serve him faithfully? Do you love him as a man, not as a lord? They had answered. I will not transcribe the conversations that followed over the next 4 days because some things are not better for being described. What I can say is that Anne came to my room first. She had been standing 3 paces behind me and watching for 5 years, and the distance had been getting shorter for all of that time. And when she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me without the professional distance she had maintained since she was 15, I understood why Raymond had said, years ago, that he found this infuriating until he understood it meant he was not alone. Claire came the second night. She was warm and direct, and she cried twice and told me I was not allowed to make her say goodbye at a memorial service again. Misery came the third night and was the most surprising of the 3, and I say this as someone who had watched her manage 2 years of financial crises without showing panic in a single report. 7 days after my mother's visit to the brothel, I went to retrieve Yoel. Anne waited outside. She did not go in, and I understood this as the specific courtesy of a person who recognizes that something must be done directly, and that proximity would muddy it. The brothel manager was very pleased to have me there in person. I went upstairs. Yoel was waiting. She had long black hair and her mother's eyes, and a way of sitting that was the same specific stillness I remembered from the plaza. The careful person who has learned the floor can disappear. She said quietly that she was not sure she deserved to be retrieved. I told her that I was the reason her father's business had failed, not the only reason. The market conditions were real. His speculation was real. But I was a cause in the chain, and that made me responsible for the debt, and I was here to settle it, not to do her a favor. She stared at me for a moment. You know who I am, she said. I have known since the plaza. She did not ask how. She filed it away the way Misery had filed away the name recognition moment, in that same particular drawer that people who deal with impossible employers develop over time. Outside, Anne was waiting. Misery and Claire were there too. Yol looked at the three of them, and the three of them looked back, and there was a specific recognition in that moment. Not explanation, not introduction, but the look of people who are already in the same story and are now sharing it. Yol said, "I will serve you even if it costs my life." Misery said, "We have been waiting. From today, you are our comrade." I brought her to the government office and told her everything. Same version I had told the other three. She took it differently from each of them. She was quiet for most of it. At the end, she said that she had wondered, when her father's business collapsed, what she had done to deserve the specific shape of that disaster. She had not expected the answer to be nothing. It was someone else's choice, and he knows it, and he came here himself to settle the debt. She said, "You are a very strange man." I am. My mother went back to Est before Yol's first full week was out. She said goodbye to me in the courtyard with her specific smile, the one that preceded sentences that changed everything. "I hope you will come to me when you are at your limit before waiting 15 years next time," she said. "I will try," I said. She patted my hand. "Also," she said. I said 4 people, not 3. She walked to the carriage. I watched her go. 4 people. I had 3. I had been counting wrong, or she had been counting ahead. I stood in the courtyard and looked at the stone with 52 names carved into it and thought about the shape of a life in which you are not the only one holding it up. The 5 faces from the execution pyre were all in the same territory now, alive, known, staying. That night, for the first time in either of my lives, I slept without the specific weight of holding everything alone. It was a different kind of sleep. I did not know what to do with it, so I lay in it and let it be what it was. In the weeks that followed, the 4 of them settled into the new arrangement with the specific efficiency that comes when people who are already good at working together no longer have to maintain the fiction that the work is all there is. Anne stopped standing 3 paces back when she was in my study. She stood next to me. This was not discussed. It happened in the way things happen when a behavior has been established through 15 years of ritual, and then one morning the ritual does not seem necessary anymore. Misery submitted her budget reports with the same precision she always had. The reports now included, occasionally in the margin, a small note that had nothing to do with the budget. The notes were brief. A report on the autumn harvest that ended with the weather has been good, and the apple trees by the inner courtyard gate are particularly productive this year, which I thought you would want to know. She was not someone who wrote unnecessary sentences. The note meant she was paying attention to more than the numbers. I wrote back. The correspondence continued. Claire came to the planning room in the evenings sometimes, when her other work was finished, and read while I worked, and occasionally said something useful about whatever I was working on. She had a precise instinct for the moment. A problem needed a second perspective, and the moment it needed to be solved alone. She offered the second perspective when it was useful, and said nothing when it was not. This is a skill that takes years to develop, and most people never do. Yol learned the territory. She walked every sector of the settlement in the first month, spoke with the administrators, read the census records that Misery had compiled over 3 years, and sat in on the food distribution meetings until she understood the system. She did not say much during these processes. She observed. At the end of the month, she came to me with 3 specific observations about inefficiencies in the eastern food distribution route that Misery confirmed were accurate and corrected within the week. She said, "The day after the corrections, I am not certain what I am able to contribute here that the others cannot." "Gravity magic," I said. "Beyond that, you see systems differently from people who built them," I said. "You see them as someone who arrived after the build and is asking what is missing. That is a specific and useful kind of seeing." She thought about this for a moment. "The first King Kale built this kingdom with fewer allies than he needed," she said. "So he made allowances in the structure for more than one person to be in the same role. Yes, you have been doing the same thing." "I have been trying to," I said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she had made a decision about something and was done discussing it. The Restorationist faction had, at roughly this same time, placed an infiltrator in my circle and decided to wait. I did not know this yet. I would find out later, in pieces, the way you find out about patient enemies. Not all at once, but accumulating, each small piece explaining the one that came before. But that was later. The king came to Taegun in late autumn of the year I turned 16, 2 weeks after the 5 territory tournament ended, and he stayed for 3 days. He was a careful man. He moved through the fortress gate with the specific attentiveness of a king who has been on the throne long enough to understand that a frontier baron with good walls is either a very good thing or a very concerning thing, and he had not yet decided which. Misery had prepared the accounts. I cannot overstate what that meant. She produced, on the morning of the first review day, a ledger system so complete and well organized that the royal auditors who had arrived 2 days early to prepare their questions found that their questions had been answered before they could ask them. Every revenue source, every expenditure category, every debt service schedule, the iron mine's current output against projected output, the mage corps enrollment by affinity type, without naming the mages, the hospital census with anonymized pathogen data, the orphanage enrollment figures against feeding cost per capita. She had anticipated everything they would want and prepared it in the language that people who audit baronies use when they want to approve what they are looking at. The auditors spent 2 hours with her and then went to dinner. The king walked the fortress walls with me and his chamberlain and 2 guards and Weiss, who had learned long ago the specific value of standing 3 paces back and not speaking unless asked. The king looked at the gate mechanism. He looked at the observation platform. He looked at the moat and the dual-use irrigation system and the hospital, whose upper floor smelled of clean linen and herbs rather than the blood and infection smell that hospitals in the capital had. He asked questions. I answered them. On the 3rd day, in the inner meeting room, he confirmed my baron title formally and awarded Tegun official status as a development territory with expanded administrative autonomy. He said the kingdom valued what had been built here. He said the investment, the border counts 20,000 gold, had returned already in tax revenue and in the military value of the Southern Gate battle. Then, he said, in a different register, he expected commensurate loyalty. I told him he had it. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who is simultaneously glad and uneasy. I was 16 years old, and I had a fortress city with 3,000 residents and a mage corps and a private intelligence network, an iron mine income, and the specific loyalty of everyone inside those walls. A frontier baron commanding this level of infrastructure was not a comfortable thing for a king to observe. The award was genuine. So was the warning. He is not the enemy, Raymond told me that evening. He is a man with a liability management problem. I know. The warning means he respects you enough to be honest about the concern. I know, I said. I filed it in the category of things that were true and could not be fixed by any action available to me, and I moved on to Rosa's plague report. She had been working on it for 11 months. She brought it to me the week after the king left, with the specific calm of a woman who has proven something she has been suspicious of for a long time and is now reading the implications. The plague was not contagious between people, not primarily, not the way the original timeline's outbreak had spread. The pathogen was introduced through the bite of a specific monster species, a small, burrowing creature that lived in the bamboo forest margins of the Demon Realm corridor. The bite introduced the pathogen. People who were bitten carried it home. The disease spread secondarily between people via a different mechanism that was much slower and much easier to interrupt, which was why some areas had contained it and some had not. The areas that could not contain it were the areas adjacent to the bamboo margins. The areas adjacent to the bamboo margins were the areas closest to the migration corridor. The migration corridor ran through the lower farmland belt and the old barony capital, where my parents had died in the original timeline, where the steward had died, where 20% of the population had died. Can we eliminate the carrier population? I asked. In the defined corridor zone, yes, Rosa said. 3 to 4 months of systematic eradication. The carrier reproduces slowly and does not migrate far. If we clear the bamboo margin zone and maintain the perimeter, reinfection risk approaches 0. I authorized the campaign that afternoon. The Mage Corps provided fire and wind suppression along the bamboo margins. Weiss's company handled the systematic clearing. It took 14 weeks. The carrier population in the Tegun corridor dropped to near 0. I sent the methodology to my mother in Est with a letter explaining what she needed to replicate in the lower farmland belt. She had the corridor near Est cleared in 2 months. The plague that the book had recorded, the disaster at age 16, the one that had taken both my parents, my sister, my steward, and 20% of the population, would not happen. It would not happen because a healer who had been given a hospital and research resources had found the mechanism. The infrastructure had done it, not the book, not the foreknowledge. The institution I had built specifically because the book told me something was coming had produced the answer through the competence of someone working in it. That distinction mattered to me more than it probably should have. The Capital Academy enrollment was the king's specific suggestion, offered at the end of the 3rd day. He framed it as an opportunity, young nobles building relationships, the barony gaining gaining visibility in the capital's political circles. It was also, and he did not say this, but neither of us needed him to, a way of watching me from close range. I enrolled in spring. Raymond came with me. The academy was not what I had expected and was exactly what Raymond had briefed me it would be. The curriculum existed and was occasionally interesting. The actual activity was the students, future lords and commanders and ambassadors, meeting each other before they held the positions that would define their relationships for 30 years. It was political groundwork dressed as education. I found it straightforward. I had 2 lifetimes of experience with people, and I was not attached to being liked, which turned out to be an effective combination for identifying who was worth building relationships with and who was not. Raymond's spatial detection ran quietly in the background. 3 weeks in, he told me one of my developing academic friendships was reading as active enemy, not a neutral, not someone with complicated allegiances. An active enemy reading in the specific calibration of his detection that indicated someone serving a hostile organization with ongoing active engagement. I thought about it for a day. The contact was smart, genuinely personable, and had introduced me to 4 other students whose value in the political network I was building had been meaningful. If I cut the connection, it would signal awareness. If I maintained it, I had a known channel for controlled information. I maintained it. Over the following months, I fed the contact carefully selected and specifically false information about Taegun's mage core capacity. I described 12 mages rather than 35. I described our fire capability as limited. I described our water mage as still in basic training. Every piece was plausible, consistent, and wrong. The restorationist faction, whoever they were, wherever they were receiving the reports, adjusted their intelligence picture of Taegun based on what I chose to give them. They were planning something. They had been planning it since before the king's visit. They had an infiltrator in my territory who Raymond had not yet identified by name, only by a directional reading that placed them somewhere in the administration cluster. I did not know when they would move. I did not know what the first action would look like. I knew the book had not predicted them. They were not in the original timeline's records, and I knew that any intelligence picture they were building from the contact's reports was 12 to 20 months behind reality. That would have to be enough. My brother Derek enrolled at the academy the same year, quietly, under an arrangement our mother had made with Margrave Hasburg and Viscount Gorman at the tournament's first night. Flora would enter the academy. The engagement announcement would follow. It would make Darek unavailable to certain types of political maneuvering that our mother had. Through Yoel's network and a new contact at the capital's administrative cluster, identified as already underway. She told me this at the family dinner after the tournament. Between sentencing my father and informing him that Yuka had been entrusted to me, and I sat in my chair and watched my mother operate with the specific awe of a man who has spent 16 years thinking he was the most prepared person in his family and was only now realizing he had the wrong comparison group. "You have 4 wives," she said to me, in the manner of someone noting a fact rather than making a criticism. "Yuko will make 5. My father looked like he was reconsidering his life choices. My brother said nothing and stared at the table. My sister Krisha, on my right, said, "I think Yuka is very nice." I filed all of it away in the category of things managed and went back to the academy and continued my intelligence work and carried the awareness that somewhere in my administration was a person with an active enemy, reading who had not yet been identified. The plague countermeasure was complete. The academy intelligence operation was running. The restorationist faction was watching from behind a false data picture. The king had what he needed to justify continued patronage and had delivered his warning, which was a fair exchange. I was 16. The list of disasters from the book was empty. The threats that remained were the ones the book had never recorded, which meant they were entirely mine to navigate. The specific difference I was finding was not larger than I had expected. It was just different in a way that required attention rather than preparation. There was one other thing from the academy year that I have not yet accounted for. Flora, the Margrave Hasburg's daughter, had enrolled the same year as Derek, as our mother had arranged. She was 18, and she had the warm directness of her father's better qualities, without his occasional tendency toward bluntness as rudeness. And she and Derek had navigated the first months of the engagement arrangement with the specific awkwardness of 2 people who have been informed they will be spending the rest of their lives together and are now determining whether they find each other tolerable before determining whether they find each other good. By the end of the year, they found each other good. I could see it in the way Darek mentioned her name in dispatches. Casually, matter-of-factly, the way you mention someone who is simply in the landscape of your life now, rather than a new addition to it. I filed this in the category of positive developments that required no action from me, which was a category I was learning to appreciate. The Academy's Magic Tactics Research Department, which had emerged from the negotiation with the headmaster, produced 3 tactical documents in the first year that I found genuinely useful. 2 of them were analyses of combined element attack formations that the Mage Corps had not considered. The third was a defense analysis that identified 3 specific vulnerabilities in our Taegun Gate approach that we had not noticed because we had built the gate and could not see it the way an attacker would. Lilia, who had produced the defense analysis, came to me afterward and said she thought the vulnerabilities should be corrected before the next engagement season. I told her to correct them, gave her the earthwork teams, and told her to write a standing update procedure for reviewing defensive positions annually. She wrote one. She also wrote a training curriculum for how to evaluate your own fortifications from the attacker's perspective, which she tested on the full Mage Corps over 2 weeks, and which became a standard quarterly exercise. I noted this in the same register I noted Rosa's plague mechanism discovery, the register of a man who has been building institutions and is beginning to watch those institutions produce output he did not specifically design. The key word is beginning. I kept paying attention. Both letters arrived on the same morning. The first was from Raymond. The Restorationist faction had moved, not later than expected, not coordinated in the way the false intelligence should have made difficult, but in the timing and configuration of a group that had made a decision and committed past the point of reconsidering. The Southern nobles, Hyorimi's forces as the spearhead, 4 other houses, 2 viscounts, and 2 barons, following behind with soldiers and a grievance they had been cultivating for 2 years. The second letter was a military intelligence report from the eastern border. The Istria Imperial Kingdom had crossed in force, 40,000 soldiers, a road they had been improving in secret for 3 years, and a timing that aligned with the Restorationist rebellion with a precision that was not accidental. I sat in the Academy's small study room, and I read both letters, and I thought about what it meant that both crises had arrived simultaneously, despite everything I had done to prevent this exact scenario. The false intelligence had not stopped them. It had changed the picture they were attacking into. They committed this particular moment, thinking I had 12 mages in Taegun and a mage corps too weak for sustained large-scale engagement. That miscalculation was real. It would matter. But the timing of the two-front attack had been coordinated by something the false intelligence could not change. The political calculus of a faction that had decided they would either win or be destroyed, and had concluded that simultaneous pressure from outside and inside was the only configuration that gave them a real chance. They were right, by the way. It was the only configuration that had a real chance. They had just built their calculation on the wrong model of what I had. I sent 3 letters in rapid succession before dawn. The first went to Weiss. I need the cavalry at the eastern border by end of week. Take Gale and the Wind Mage Battalion. Leave Kira with Taegun's defense complement. Hold the advance. Do not pursue past the border. I need you capable of redeployment if the southern situation requires it. The second went to Darek. You have the southern front. I am assigning you a gravity mage partner. His name is Rafal. He will pin anyone you want pinned. Take Hyorimi alive. I know how he fights. He pushes hard and then retreats to distance when the engagement starts to turn. Rafal will close that option. You will not need to chase him. The third went to Raymond. Confirm the infiltrator. Whatever you have now, whatever direction the detection gives you, send it. I will handle the rest from here. Also, notify Misery that I am riding east. Tell her to hold the administration exactly as currently structured and not to wait for me before making operational decisions. Then, I rode for the Eastern Front. The Academy headmaster met me in the courtyard as I was mounting. He was there before I arrived, which told me he had been informed of the letters before I had been, which meant he had his own intelligence network, which I had suspected and was now confirmed. He looked at me with the specific calm of a man who expected exactly this. The headmaster looked toward the gate. I would advise against the Eastern engagement personally. You are more valuable in the capital managing the political response. The political response is Raymond and Clarice, I said. The Eastern engagement needs the red powder tactic, and there is no one else who has run the tests. He looked at me for a moment. At least take your guard. Anne was already at the gate. She had been ready before I asked, which was not surprising. She had been doing that since she was 15. The Eastern engagement was not the decisive front. I understood this before I arrived. The Istrian invasion was real and needed to be repelled, but it was the designed distraction. The crisis intended to pull the kingdom's military attention east, while the Restorationist rebellion unpicked the southern administrative network. Weiss would hold the east. My job there was to learn the terrain, save as many soldiers as possible from the first wave mistakes that every new battle produces, and deploy the red powder bombardment tactic I had been developing for 8 months before anyone realized it existed. Margrave Hamish received me at the Eastern Front with the wariness of a man who has been told a 16-year-old count is coming with a secret weapon and is deciding whether to trust this information or the other 16-year-old count he had met 6 months ago at the academy. He put me in the rear guard. I accepted this without discussion. The vanguard was full of noble sons eager for glory, and the first engagement went exactly as badly as I had watched the first Sun's Night Order go badly at Southern Gate. Arrogant cavalry, narrow terrain, archers they hadn't respected, and then a chaotic retreat that cost more lives than the ground gained was worth. I watched it from the rear guard and felt the specific tired frustration of a man who has seen this before and cannot fix it from behind. Then I presented the red powder bombardment. The ceramic shells were filled with a concentrated capsaicin preparation that Bart's trading missions had sourced from coastal merchants over 3 years. When shattered against stone or against armor, the powder dispersed into a choking, blinding cloud that made accurate archery impossible. The enemy fort's defenders had excellent long-range longbow archers. They were extraordinary archers, actually. They had been holding a narrow frontier approach with 5,000 soldiers against 25,000 for 10 days, and the conventional assault casualty rate was running at roughly 3 allied soldiers per enemy defender per day. They had never encountered burning eyes and lungs before. I spent 3 days getting Hamish's approval for the approach, 2 days staging the catapult positions on the rock mountain overlooking the fort's main wall, and 1 day confirming the wind patterns with Gale. The assault required a specific wind direction to carry the powder into the defensive positions, rather than back toward our own lines. Gale had been reading wind patterns since before he knew he was a wind mage. On day 11, Hamish gave the order. The bells rang. The catapults released. The ceramic shells hit the stone of the fort's main wall and shattered in the specific way things shatter when they have been engineered to disperse rather than impact. The powder cloud moved in the morning wind. The longbow archers on the wall stopped shooting. The crossbow battalions opened. The main assault force moved with sandbags to the base of the wall. The gate team breached the side entrance with equipment Elon had designed specifically for the dimensions of Eastern Frontier Fort construction. The cavalry charged through when the gates opened. The fort fell on day 11 with 18 casualties. Hamish Margrave gave me a long look after the casualty reports came in. 130 casualties had been projected for a conventional assault on this position, based on the engagement data from the previous 10 days. He said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then he wrote a recommendation letter for the merit review. The plague news arrived on the same day. A messenger from Tagon, thin from hard riding, handed me a letter with the Solus House seal. The letter was from Misery. The plague had broken out in the eastern villages near the bamboo margin. Exactly what Rosa had warned could happen if the carrier population reasserted from the deeper forest during a period of unusual monster activity, which the invasion-adjacent monster surge had apparently produced. I read the letter twice. Then I sat down on a supply crate in the middle of the camp and did not move for approximately 4 minutes. Anne said, from behind me, "Tile, not Lord, not Sir, just my name," in the voice she used when she was indicating that the current physical and emotional state was unacceptable without yet making it a command. "I know," I said. "Rosa is there. Misery is there. Claire is there. The hospital exists and is staffed specifically for this. I know. The carrier eradication campaign reduced the baseline population. This is a residual outbreak, not the full mechanism. I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down on a crate next to me, which was something she had never done before in a camp setting. That was a departure from protocol, the kind of departure she only permitted herself when she had concluded that protocol was actively counterproductive. "You built the infrastructure," she said. "Let it work." I looked at the letter. I looked at the casualty reports from the fort assault. I thought about a crib and a book and 5 disasters on a list and the specific terror of being 3 years old with the knowledge of everything that was going to happen and no body that could prevent it. We were no longer in that position. "Send Krisha back to Taegun," I said. "She has healing magic. She is not needed here. Tell her the carrier eradication protocol and send her back." Anne said, "I will handle it." She did. She handled it in an hour, including writing the orders that I had not written yet and having my horse ready when I stood up. I had 3 more days at the Eastern Front before the fort situation was stable enough for Hamish to manage without me. I spent them reading every intelligence report from the Southern Front that Raymond could relay east through Bart's transportation network. Darek's front was moving exactly as I had planned it. Hiyorimi had committed fully to the Rebel Alliance. He had put himself personally at the head of the Southern engagement because he expected to win quickly. He had seen the intelligence picture the false data had created, and by that picture, his forces had a significant advantage against a mage corps weakened and stretched thin by the Academy year. He had ridden to the front in the specific way a man rides to a battle he expects to conclude before dinner. He met Rafal, the gravity mage, Yol's cohort. He had trained alongside her in the initial magic core sessions, had been one of the group that watched her demonstrate gravity arrest for the first time in the practice yard, and had understood before any formal instruction what the tactical implications were. He had a specific talent. He could apply arrest to a moving target at range, not just a stationary one. Most gravity mages who had the skill applied it as a static hold. Rafal had spent 2 years developing the ability to project it into motion, to intercept a retreating figure and establish the hold before the figure reached safe distance. I had known, when I assigned him to Darek, that Hiyorimi would try to retreat. I had watched him do it for 6 years, commit hard to the front, establish early momentum, then pull back to distance when the engagement turned, and let subordinates absorb the cost of the collapse. He had done it in the flood relief confrontation. He had done it in the territorial seizure attempt. He had done it in every piece of intelligence we had collected on his tactical style, across 6 years of careful observation. He had never been in an engagement where retreat was not an option. Darek's report was factual. The engagement began mid-morning. Hiyorimi's forces outnumbered Darek's initial force by about 40%, which Hiyorimi expected to be decisive. The engagement turned when Carlene's Wind Mage Battalion created a sustained suppression field that collapsed the coordination of Hiyorimi's left wing. He had not known about the Wind Mage Battalion because the false intelligence I had fed through the Academy contact had not mentioned Wind Mages at all. Hiyorimi's right wing was holding when his left wing broke, and he made the decision he always made when he was losing on one side. He started to pull back to distance. Rafal pinned him. There is no graceful way to describe what gravity magic arrest looks like when applied to a mounted man attempting to run. The horse stepped away from under him. He stayed where he was, held in place by forces his body recognized as gravitational, and his command training had provided no response for. He stood in the middle of a disintegrating engagement, unable to move in any direction, while Darek's cavalry encircled what remained of his forces. He had time to look around. He had time to understand what had happened and what it meant. Darek rode up. Darek was 19 years old, and he had been waiting for this specific moment, not personally, not out of hatred, but in the way a soldier waits for the engagement that closes the engagement, for longer than he had been old enough to know why. "Hiyorimi, your forces have broken. Surrender your sword." Hiyorimi looked at the situation, the immobilization, the encirclement, the collapse of his forces, the gravity mage 40 meters away, maintaining the arrest, with the calm of someone for whom this was not yet at maximum effort, and said, "I surrender." Darek took the sword. He wrote me a report in the specific professional style that 15 years of watching his younger brother draft dispatches had apparently taught him by osmosis. Hiyorimi is in custody. His son Errol was captured in the subsequent mop-up engagement. The Southern Rebellion has collapsed at every coordinated point following the field commander's capture. I have confirmed loyalty declarations from the remaining rebel-aligned houses, awaiting your direction regarding disposition. I read this 3 times. The 3rd time, I was aware of something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, something quieter than both, that had more to do with the specific weight of a man who has been causing problems since you were 10 years old, finally being removed from the equation in a way that does not require you to feel bad about it. He had attacked the relief operation. He had tried to seize Taegun. He had served as the Restorationist faction's primary military instrument for 2 years. He had been the ground-level obstacle that every other obstacle had referenced since the early years of this plan. He was in custody. His son was in custody. The rebellion was broken. I rode back to the capital. The ride took 6 days. I spent most of it reviewing the post-rebellion settlement documentation that Raymond and Misery had prepared together, who surrendered when, under what conditions, what provisional governance looked like in the territories the rebel lords had vacated, how the transition funds were being structured. Misery had summarized 300 pages in 12. The summary was better than the documentation. The Restorationist faction had fragmented the moment Hiyorimi's capture became known. 2 rebel viscounts had sent loyalty declarations before Derek's engagement was completed. The other 2 surrendered in person to Derek's forces the following day. The rebel baron houses had declared separately, through their local administrators, within 72 hours. The 4 marquises who had funded the rebellion were waiting in the capital with their voluntary atonement packages already prepared. 400,000 gold total, 10 mages each to the Knight Order, and resignation documents covering every ministry they collectively held. The documentation had clearly been prepared well before the rebellion failed. They had anticipated this outcome and designed for it. Raymond's intelligence summary noted that the atonement offer arrived within 2 hours of Hiyorimi's capture being confirmed. They had the offer prepared. They had had it prepared for some time. This told me something specific about the kind of intelligence operation the Restorationist faction had been running. They had invested in failure preparation as thoroughly as in success preparation. This is rare. Most political operations do not do this, because preparing for failure acknowledges that failure is possible, and most political operators are not comfortable with that acknowledgement. The marquises had been comfortable with it. They had designed for the contingency. They had lost anyway, because their model of what I had was wrong, but their operational discipline was real. I filed them in the category of threats to watch after the ceremony, not because they would move again soon, they would not, but because people with that kind of operational discipline do not stop being threats because they have lost a round. The merit ceremony was held at the end of summer in the capital's throne room, with 300 nobles assembled, and the specific weight of recent events making everyone conscious of the stakes. The king announced the punishments first. Former Count Goyoku and former Viscount Hiyorimi received death sentences and full confiscation. 3 other rebel commanders received the same. The families of the 4 marquises who had funded the rebellion, not the marquises themselves, who had offered voluntary atonement before the ceremony, received no punishment, which was the specific mercy of a king who understood that punishing the innocent relatives of guilty men creates the next generation of grievance. The marquises' voluntary atonement, 400,000 gold total, 10 mages each to the Knight Order, resignation from every ministerial post they held. The 4 ministries had been in those families for 3 generations. Losing them was, as I had explained to Raymond some months earlier, equivalent to death in noble political terms, just a slower and more deniable version. The king accepted the atonement with the warmth of a man who has won a negotiation he designed. I watched all of this and filed it carefully. Then came the promotions. Dorek from baronet to viscount, 60,000 gold, 2 former rebel territories as direct holdings. He stood when his name was called, with the specific straight posture of someone who had grown into the soldier the first battle at Southern Gate had suggested he would become. I was promoted from baron to viscount on the eastern border merits. The king said the merit award was not finished yet, and promoted me from viscount to count on the southern rebellion merits. Then he said the merit award was still not finished. The room was very quiet. The new title was Demon Frontier Count, equivalent in rank to a marca, but created for the frontier development role specifically. It came with an expanded territory, confiscated rebel lands, including the former Hiyorimi and Goyoku holdings, plus a land exchange with Cornell Barony that gave Cornell better territory in exchange for their western lands coming under my administration. It came with 360,000 gold in combined rewards and preparation funds. It came with a charter to build the defensive network west of Southern Gate, which meant the king was formalizing what I had already started doing informally. It came with, "The kingdom's greatest calamity is coming. Prepare for it." I said I would respond with loyalty commensurate with the honor. The king smiled. I had the specific feeling of a man being outmaneuvered by someone better at this than he was, and being correctly grateful for it simultaneously, because the outmaneuvering was in a direction that served both of us and the alternative. Having a frontier lord with this level of military infrastructure operating outside the formal structure was worse for everyone, including me. At the ceremony's end, Errol, Hiyorimi's son, who had tried to seize Taegun in the 3rd year and had been captured in the dual front war mop-up, was brought forward for sentencing. He received a pardon. He received a minor barony, a new family name, Copper, which he had chosen himself, saying he wanted to start from the bottom rather than inheriting the tarnished silver of what came before, and command of one of the new Frontier Knight Corps under Darik's administration. He looked at this outcome with the specific expression of a man who had expected execution and was now required to live responsibly. I did not know yet whether he was the kind of man who could carry that. Time would answer the question. Darik found me in the hallway afterward. 360,000, he said. Yes, and a county, and a county. You are 17, I am aware. He looked at the ceiling in the way he did when he was deciding between several responses and had concluded none of them were adequate. You are going to spend it all on walls, he said, and mages, and Weiss's cavalry expansion, and whatever the king means by greatest calamity, which I do not yet know but intend to find out. He was quiet for a moment. I will come to every battle, he said. You know that. I had been counting on it since he was 11 years old, and I was 9, and I had not yet had the right moment to say so. I know, I said. The distinction between being told something and knowing it is sometimes the same distinction as being told you are not alone and understanding it in a way you can actually use. I had heard Darik say things like this for years, standing in the hallway with the weight of the new title already settling into its shape, hearing him say it now, after 2 simultaneous wars, after Hiorami's capture, after the specific relief of a plan that had worked despite the specific cost of it. I understood it in the second way. The restorationist faction was broken. Hiorami was in custody. The Eastern invasion was repelled. I had 360,000 gold and a county and a charter that made me the primary frontier defense architect for the kingdom. I had Weiss and Derek and Raymond and Misery and Anne and Claire and Yol. I had been doing this alone in a crib with a book beside me at the beginning of this life, and I was doing it with those names in the room. The distinction mattered. What came next was the king's greatest calamity, whatever that was. I had been preparing for things that were not on any list for 2 years now. I had gotten reasonably good at it. The Ferrar Duchy was the political problem that had been underneath the rebellion the entire time. The 4 marquises who funded the restorationist faction had done so through Ferrar court channels, not directly enough to be provable, but consistently enough to be readable, once Raymond's spatial detection had been mapping the communication flows for 6 months. The duchy sat at the junction of 3 trade routes and 2 political alliances. If Ferrar aligned with the remnants of the restorationist faction and the incoming Griffonia pressure, we were looking at a 3-front war with reduced allied support. If Ferrar was neutral, we were looking at a manageable 2-front war with improved diplomatic space. I planned the mission for 3 months. I assembled the delegation with care. Misery for the financial negotiation. She had managed near bankruptcy under wartime pressure, which meant she could read a budget with the specific attention of someone who has watched money disappear and survived it. I wanted Ferrar's treasurer to be speaking to someone who could not be impressed by large numbers, because she had managed larger numbers in worse conditions. Yol I brought because her gravity magic was the only one in the kingdom, and the Ferrar court knew this, and knowing this, while looking across a negotiating table at her, was a specific kind of information. The Duke was a cautious man. He had the specific caution of someone whose position depends on being correctly positioned relative to every power around him, and he had spent 20 years developing the instinct to not commit until commitment was unavoidable. He looked at my delegation with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. I did not try to charm him. I offered him specific things, a direct trade arrangement that bypassed the intermediaries the restorationist faction had been using to extract fees for the past decade, a security compact that committed Taegun's border knight forces to route coverage on his western approaches, and a standing invitation for his merchants to operate in Taegun's public goods exchange at rates more favorable than the capital's tariffs. He accepted none of it. He said he would consider. I said that was completely reasonable and that I would be returning to Taegun in the spring, and he was welcome to send a delegation then to continue the discussion. We parted with the specific warmth of 2 people who have concluded that working against each other would cost more than either of them wanted to spend. Princess Clarice was present at the Ferrar court as a diplomatic observer for the crown. She was 20 years old, and she had the practiced stillness of a woman who has spent years being underestimated and has learned to use this as an intelligence asset. She watched the delegation negotiations without appearing to watch them, and she spoke to me afterward in the side corridor with the directness of someone who has decided that pretense is inefficient. The Duke will send a delegation to Taegun, she said. Yes, he won't commit to the compact. He'll maintain trade relations and keep his options open. That is sufficient, I said. Neutral fair art is what I came for. She looked at me with the assessment I was beginning to recognize as her specific register. Not hostility, not approval, but the focused evaluation of someone deciding whether what she is seeing matches what she was told. The king asked me to evaluate you, she said. I know. He said you would know. The king is very good at his job, I said. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. I asked her to join my command structure as a liaison officer between the Frontier Count's operations and the Royal Diplomatic Apparatus. She thought about it for approximately 10 seconds. Yes, she said, on the condition that I receive full intelligence access when I am assigned to an operation. Agreed. That was how I acquired Princess Clarice. I mention this because later, in the years that followed, when people ask how a demon frontier count managed a triple front war with adequate diplomatic coordination, the answer is Clarice, who had been thinking about this kind of problem her entire adult life and had simply been waiting for someone to give her the access she needed to solve it. The drought came in early summer. It was not on any list I still maintained. It arrived the way weather arrives, without announcement, without the specific warning that the demon realm's monster migration gave to the plague, without a book entry or a historical pattern I had specifically mapped. It was simply a long, dry spring that continued into summer and showed no signs of stopping. The food reserve system had been running for 12 years. The answer to the drought was not heroics. It was the supply chain. Bart's spatial storage magic had been operating continuous transport routes for a decade, keeping the regional reserves balanced against seasonal fluctuations. Alon and Mary's earth magic teams had extended the irrigation network across the lower farmland belt in 2 construction campaigns. The turnip cultivation program, which I had started at age 7 because Zhuge Liang once used turnips to feed an army in the field, was now a permanent agricultural track in 4 territories. Not a single person died of hunger that year. I noted this in the same way you note a system working correctly, with satisfaction and without ceremony, and then went back to the wedding plans. We held the ceremony in late summer when the drought had broken. I had thought about how to do this for 2 years. The practical constraints were manageable. Legal framework for multiple wives existed in the kingdom's charter, which had been established by the first King Kyle, who built the realm with too few loyal lords and had needed to accommodate their various arrangements. The political constraints were real, but not insurmountable. Demon Frontier Count was close enough to Margrave rank that the social structure allowed it, and the king had already made clear he preferred me allied and stable rather than potentially maneuverable through marriage pressure. The witnesses were Border Count Hallsberg, who had invested 20,000 gold in the fortress city and received it back with interest, and who stood in the front row with the expression of a man who has bet correctly and is choosing not to say so. Princess Clarice, acting in her capacity as royal liaison. Raymond, who stood 3 paces back from the ceremony proceedings, the way he stood 3 paces back from everything, and whose expression was the specific one he wore when a thing had arrived at its correct conclusion. Darek, who kept making faces at Krisha across the aisle and losing the battle to maintain ceremony composure. Krisha herself, who was winning that battle with their mother's specific smile. Weiss stood at the back with his arms folded and said nothing throughout, which was how he expressed that something was right. The ceremony was in the order I had decided. Anne first, then Misery, then Claire, then Yol. I had written no vows. I had been advised to write vows by every person who had helped plan the ceremony, and I had declined each time, because I am someone who plans things obsessively, and there are still a small number of things I will not plan, and this was one of them. What I said to each of them was specific. To Anne, that she had been beside me since I was 10 years old, and I had never once questioned whether she would be there tomorrow. And I did not have a word for what that certainty is worth, but I knew the figure was larger than anything I had priced in either life. To Misery, that when the budget had been at its worst, and the fortress was 3 weeks from going bankrupt, and she had sent me a report that was precise and professional, and completely without panic, I had understood for the first time that the difference between a competent person and an indispensable person is not skill. It is the specific choice to not panic in the room where panic would be acceptable. To Claire, that she had put her arms around me in a courtyard and told me the fallen would want me to smile, and I had not known until that moment how completely I had been holding the grief alone, and it is still the best thing anyone has ever told me. To Yol, that I had watched her face in a town square when I was 15 and already dead twice, and I had thought, there she is. And then I had spent 2 years working out how to be someone she could actually know. and here she is. There was the expected crying, not mine. I had also planned for that. The king visited Taegun the following spring for the tournament. He arrived with a retinue of 402 border counts and the Duke of Klein, who wanted to send an observation team to study the territory administration. His speech to the assembled citizens was the kind of speech a king gives when he is trying to say, "I see you, and I will protect you, and I mean it." The children had made a flower path with bamboo tubes, and the wind mages scattered petals, and Carl the carpenter had built flower pattern lanterns that threw light in shapes on the ground. And the whole thing was, I will admit, somewhat more beautiful than the planning sessions, for it had suggested it would be. I stood in the carriage beside him with Halsberg and the academy headmaster, who had invited himself with the specific energy of a man who has earned the right to be present and will not be asked to justify it. The headmaster looked at the flower path and the light and the 3,000 residents who had cleaned the roads themselves and said, very quietly, "You know, I have been doing this for a long time." "I know," I said. He looked at the road again. "I have not seen this before." I did not say anything. I watched the children run alongside the carriage route with their flowers, and I thought about a crib and a book and the specific sensation of waking up in a body that cannot walk yet and knowing exactly what you have to build. The drought itself was over by late summer without a single famine death. I noted this in the same way I noted a supply chain working correctly, with satisfaction and without ceremony, and moved on. The tournament had run the week before the king's visit. Krisha and Flora and Yuka had turned the betting system into a competition between themselves that produced more gold for all three than the bookmaker had accounted for, and had also provided the most complete intelligence picture of every territory's military training status I had received in years. My mother, who attended, watched this happen with the specific expression of a woman who had arranged for 3 young women to be in the same room for exactly this purpose. "They are very good," she said. "They are. You did not put them in the same room. You put them in the same room," I said. She smiled. We agreed to disagree about whether this had been her design or simply her facilitation, which is the same negotiation we have been having since I was 15. The king's visit had confirmed Taegun's institutional standing in the kingdom's formal record and had delivered the warning I had been expecting since the merit ceremony. Commensurate loyalty. I had said I would provide it. I meant that. The warning and the promise were both genuine, and neither of them changed what I was planning, because what I was planning was the same thing the warning was asking for. The mass wedding was the formal close of 8 years of managed distance between me and the inner circle. I have described what I said to each of them, and I will not repeat it here. What I will say is that the ceremony felt different from every other ceremony I had attended in this life, including the merit ceremony in the capital throne room, because the merit ceremony was the kingdom acknowledging what I had built, and the wedding was me acknowledging what had been there all along. Anne was first. She stood across from me with the specific stillness she had developed over 15 years of choosing not to show what she was thinking, and I watched it finally rest. Misery was second. She managed the occasion with the same precision she brought to budget reports, which sounds like an insult and is not. It is the way she loves things, through the care of getting them exactly right. Claire cried twice and apologized for it once, which was Claire in precise summary. Yol stood in front of me in the Taegun courtyard, where I had once sat alone with 52 names, and when I said to her what I had been thinking about saying since I recognized her face in the festival crowd, she was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not think you remembered. I have remembered since the execution," I said. "Since the fire. You were the last to kneel. I did not know your name then. I know it now." She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried easily. She looked at me with the specific assessment she had been refining since the day I met her, and then she said, "Then we are properly introduced." Finally, we were. Raymond's intelligence summary came in at the end of that season, 3 weeks after the king's departure. He presented it in the planning room with the specific quiet he used when something was important and unresolved. The summary described a pattern in the empire's peace preparation activity, a strategist assigned to the eventual treaty architecture who had been systematically removing certain analysts from information flows, not replacing them, simply ensuring they were not in the room during specific conversations. The strategist had, according to the fragmentary reports, specifically identified one frontier lord as the analyst most likely to see through a well-designed treaty trap. He had named the analysis style rather than the person, someone who reads political documents the way an engineer reads stress calculations. That description was me. "He is building the peace treaty to occur without your input," Raymond said. "I know," I said. He does not know you know. That advantage is time limited, I said. Once the war ends, the treaty process starts. And if he is good enough to engineer my absence, he is good enough to notice when I am not absent. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He is called Sieghart, he said. Imperial Army strategist. Cold logic. No known emotional attachments. I looked at the intelligence summary for a long time. Sieghart had not been in the book. The book had recorded the invasion and the barony's fall and my death at 20, but it had not recorded what the peace had looked like because I had been dead when the peace was made. Whatever Sieghart was building, it was built on the assumption that the man who had won the war would not be present to undo it in the negotiating room. He was not wrong about the shape of the problem. He was wrong about my absence. When the war ends, I said, I will be at the table. Raymond wrote it down. He had a habit of writing things down that were not yet plans, things that needed to become plans. He had been doing this since he first sat in the planning room with me at age 12 and asked what else. The same question, a different room, a longer list. What else? Always what else? The war arrived in the way wars arrive, when someone has been designing the approach for years, all at once, from 3 directions, with the timing calibrated specifically to the moment my forces were at their widest operational extension. Griffonia from the west, with the first prince leading, Istria from the east, and the Ferrart rebel faction from the south. The faction I had thought neutralized, except that I had neutralized the Duke and not the faction, which was a distinction I was about to learn cost lives. The first report came in before dawn. The second followed within the hour. The third, Carius's defense position compromised, arrived in the middle of the deployment meeting I was holding to respond to the first 2. I set the letter down on the table. Raymond was watching me. Weiss was watching me. Princess Clarice, attending her first full operational briefing, was watching me with the specific attention of someone who is measuring the gap between what was prepared and what is happening. Carius betrayed his position, I said. Yes, Raymond said. The southern gate fell. Yes. The gate that had held in the Griffonia War, the defensive position I had built around for 10 years. It was not a military failure. The walls were there, the mages were there, the supply line was intact. It fell because the man holding a critical interior position had received a grievance-based manipulation from a restorationist remnant over a promotion he had been passed over for, and his disposition had shifted, and Raymond's detection had not caught it because detection reads the moment, not the months-long process of a man deciding to betray. This was the limit I had always known existed. I had built the detection system, and I had trusted it, and it had done exactly what it was designed to do. Read dispositions in the present tense. It could not read the decision a man was slowly constructing over 8 months of quiet resentment. It could not flag the conversation in a tavern 2 months ago that had given the resentment a direction. I had prepared a secondary defensive line specifically for the case of the gate being taken from inside. Christoph had built it. Misery had funded it without being told why. The secondary line was 1,500 meters behind the gate, narrower, with elevated crossbow positions, and a water channel that could be flooded on a 30-second timer. The gate fell. The secondary line held. The Griffonia advance found a wall where it expected an open road. The advance slowed. That was what the secondary line was for, not to stop the army, but to slow it, to turn 3 days of planned advance into 6 days, to give Weiss time to position. I had known the system had one genuine limit. I had prepared accordingly. I had not known the betrayer's name. He would be addressed later. Right now, there were 3 armies. Darek holds the east, I said. He has the Istrian engagement. He knows the eastern terrain, and he has the Estol bow battalions. Tell him to hold the advance, but not to pursue if they retreat. I need him available for redeployment if the situation shifts. Understood, Raymond said. Clarice manages the Ferrart southern pressure. She has Yol and the Gravity Mage Battalion. The Ferrart rebel faction has numbers, but no organizational cohesion. They fell apart when Hiorami fell in the dual front war, and they have not recovered. A gravity demonstration on their field commander should collapse the engagement within the first day. Clarice said, "What is my operational authority?" "Full," I said. "If you think you need it, you have it. Do not wait for confirmation from me. I will be out of communication range for the western approach." She wrote something down. That was all. Weiss said, "The withdrawal route prediction, you are certain." I watched him use the left corridor twice under pressure in the Griffonia War, I said. The intelligence from our last year of preparation showed he conducted 2 training exercises specifically for left flank withdrawal. He knows it is his preferred option. He has improved his execution. He has not changed the preference. Weiss was quiet for a moment. He had the expression he wore when he was running battle mathematics in the back of his mind, while appearing to simply stand there. Weiss was quiet. 800 cavalry at the second exit, not the first. The first is too obvious from the main line. He would see it during the engagement setup. The second is 2 hours from the main position at speed. He would not send scouts there until he had already decided to move. And if he uses the third exit, then we are 2 hours behind him, and he has a lead we cannot close before the border, I said. That is the risk. If he reads it correctly, he escapes. If he uses the default preference under pressure, which is what every intelligence report on his command style says he does not. Weiss said nothing further. He went to prepare the cavalry. I rode west. The Griffonia advance had stalled on the secondary defensive line, exactly as designed, and was working methodically to find a path through it when my forces arrived. The first prince had brought 40,000 soldiers. He had studied the previous Griffonia war engagement. The advance formation was different, slower, more prepared to absorb the initial shock of the prepared defense, rather than committing fast to a corridor approach. He was not the same commander he had been 9 years ago. 9 years had given him a better understanding of what he was attacking into. 9 years had also given me complete familiarity with his command patterns. He had 3 tactical preferences when an engagement began to turn against him. The first was a feigned retreat to draw pursuit into a prepared secondary position. The second was a mass cavalry charge against an exposed flank. The third, the one I had watched him use twice in the previous Griffonia war engagement when he was under genuine pressure, was a personal withdrawal through the left side corridor that ran parallel to his main route, fast, abandoning the field battle to preserve his command authority for whatever came next. The left side corridor had 3 viable exit points. I sent Weiss with 800 cavalry to the second exit point 2 days before the engagement began. I rode west. The Griffonia advance had been stalled on the secondary defensive line for 4 days when I arrived. The army had found the secondary line exactly as designed, a barrier where they expected open road, and had been methodically probing for weaknesses rather than committing to a frontal assault. This told me the first prince had learned from the Griffonia war. He was not going to break himself on a prepared position the way the Gort border count had broken the iron cavalry on the hill trenches. Good. A careful commander who has learned from one engagement is still a commander with patterns. His primary advance was stalled. His flanking force, smaller than the Griffonia war, more mobile, was probing the left corridor. He was doing exactly what I expected him to do when faced with a prepared secondary position, looking for the path that let him bypass the wall rather than go through it. The left side corridor ran parallel to his main route. It had 3 viable exit points. The first exit was obvious from his current approach line. Any reconnaissance would identify it, and he would know we had identified it. The third exit was the conservative option, further from the main route, requiring a longer diversion that his supply line could not easily support. The second exit was 2 hours from the main position at full cavalry speed. It was the option a commander would reach for when an engagement was going wrong, and he needed to disengage quickly, preserve the command authority, and rebuild from a position of retreat. It was the option that required commitment to a specific path before the battle turned, which meant the commander had to judge the engagement's direction before it was fully decided. The first prince was excellent at that judgment. I had watched him make it twice. The engagement began on the 3rd day after my arrival. The Mage Corps opened with the Taegun Pass fire formation, not the full-scale corridor approach from the Griffonia War, which was terrain-dependent, but the coordinated suppression pattern that Christoph had developed for open-ground engagement, overlapping fire arcs that channeled the advancing cavalry into the Estol bow kill zones rather than letting them spread laterally. The first prince's command was excellent. He read the Mage Corps deployment correctly, read the Estol bow battalion positions correctly, identified the flanking trap I had laid for the second feint, and declined it cleanly. He was significantly better than the Griffonia War. He had prepared for the battle he expected. He had not prepared for the battle he got, because the battle he got was designed around the third tactical preference he had demonstrated under pressure. When the right wing collapsed under Weiss's cavalry press, the first prince did what he had done twice before under pressure. He withdrew through the left side corridor. Weiss was waiting at the second exit point. The first prince's escort was 18 cavalry. Weiss had 800. The surrender was formal and brief, because a man with 18 cavalry who has just ridden into 800 is making a mathematical decision, not a military one. I received the surrender in the field with the specific flatness of a man who is already thinking about what comes next. You will be treated according to the standards we apply to all prisoners, I said, respectfully and functionally. He looked at me with the expression of someone processing the complete failure of a plan he had spent 9 years refining. You knew which path I would take, he said. I knew which path you preferred. I watched you take it twice. The Western Army, without its command authority, fractured. The Mage Corps and Estol Bow battalions closed the engagement over the following 48 hours. We took prisoners in quantity and treated them the way we always had. The Matsuyama method, which I had named after a prisoner camp I had once read about in a Japan that no longer had any version of me in it. Darik's Eastern engagement report came in that evening. Istrian advance repelled, the Eastern Front holding, Darik requesting discretion to pursue past the border. I told him to hold position. The war was won. I did not want him to win it expensively. Clarice's Southern report came in shortly after. Fair Art rebel faction broke after the second Yol gravity pin demonstration, when the rebel commander found himself unable to step backward in any direction for 4 consecutive minutes. He concluded that the engagement was not going the way his planning had suggested. 3 fronts, 3 engagements. The gate that fell was recovered through the secondary defensive line. Kyrios was in custody pending the formal review process. I had the first prints. The war was won. Raymond's message arrived 12 hours after the Western surrender. He had obtained the treaty text through the intelligence network, not Sieghart's internal draft, which no amount of lateral intelligence work would produce, but the official treaty as presented to the kingdom's diplomatic delegation by Prince Grat's office 3 days earlier. He had read it. He sent it to me in full with the specific note that it would reach ratification within 48 hours if no formal objection was raised by a royal advisory officer of sufficient rank, and that the objection had to be delivered in person at the capital before the ratification ceremony. He also sent his analysis. Raymond's analysis was 9 pages, precise, and reached the same conclusion I reached in 20 minutes of reading the treaty text myself. He had simply gotten there faster because he had been watching for this specific pattern longer. I read the treaty. Sieghart was, and I am choosing this word carefully because I do not use it easily, brilliant. The reparations terms were genuinely generous, more generous than the kingdom had a right to expect from an empire that had lost the field engagement but retained most of its army. 40 million gold in reparations over 10 years, structured so the payments arrived in the first 3 years before any of the ambiguous provisions would be actionable. This was intentional. When people receive 40 million gold in 3 years, they are not in the mood to read the footnotes. The territorial withdrawal was real and verifiable. The empire withdrew from 6 border positions it had held for decades and acknowledged kingdom sovereignty over 2 territories where the legal status had been in dispute for a generation. These were genuine concessions that had genuine political value and would be celebrated by the nobles and merchants who had been fighting over those territories their entire careers. The prisoner exchange was comprehensive and would be welcomed by families on both sides who had lost people to the war. This was the humane provision, the one that would be read aloud at the signing ceremony as proof of the empire's good faith. The treaty was, on its face, exactly what a victorious kingdom should want from a peace, an empire that acknowledges defeat and offers tangible concessions. And then there were 3 provisions nested in the administrative language of the border framework section. Section 17, pages 43 through 46, in language that was not quite impenetrable, but required careful reading against the kingdom's existing legal framework to understand what it was actually doing. The first created an ambiguous sovereignty clause over 2 border fortresses that the empire had withdrawn from as part of the territorial concession. The language acknowledged kingdom administrative control while referencing historical imperial maintenance rights. In ordinary diplomatic language, this kind of clause is resolved clearly. Sieghart had written it so that both readings were grammatically valid, with the empire's preferred reading available in the technical annex that would only be referenced if the clause was contested. The fortresses were in kingdom territory. The clause meant that contesting that fact 18 months from now would require the kingdom to acknowledge that the other reading existed, which it was not prepared to do because the other reading should not exist. The second established a trade dependency routing. The kingdom's northern merchant guilds would connect to imperial clearinghouse infrastructure for the handling of war reparation payments. The 40 million gold would pass through a shared processing network over the payment period. This looked like administrative convenience. It was the kind of institutional relationship that, once established for 10 years of payment processing, becomes load-bearing. Remove it, and the reparations mechanism breaks down. Keep it, and the empire has an administrative footprint in the kingdom's northern commercial infrastructure that persists after the payments end. The The third removed the standing mutual defense clause between the kingdom and its two Northern Alliance partners, the partners whose positions on the kingdom's northern flank had been the primary strategic deterrent to imperial expansion in that direction for 40 years. Sieghart replaced the clause with a consultation requirement. The consultation requirement had no binding mechanism. If either ally was attacked, the kingdom would be notified and invited to discuss a response. The empire's path to those allies, and through them to the kingdom's northern flank, was now a policy conversation rather than a treaty obligation. Each provision had a legitimate reading. Each could be explained individually as a reasonable administrative arrangement or a small diplomatic compromise. The reparations payment structure was convenient. The sovereignty language was an acknowledgement of historical complexity. The mutual defense change was a modernization of the security framework. Together, they were the mechanism by which an empire that had lost the war would win the peace inside 10 years. I held the treaty text for a long time. Sieghart had designed this for a room with no one in it who could see all three provisions simultaneously. He had designed it for a room where the celebration of victory was so loud that the people who should be reading slowly were reading fast. He had designed it for the specific absence of the one analyst in the kingdom whose job it was to notice things like this. He had also, I had to acknowledge, designed it very nearly correctly. I handed Raymond's message and the treaty text to Clarice. She read it in 2 minutes. She had the same kind of reading speed I had, the speed of someone who knows which paragraphs to skip and which ones to slow down for, which is a skill that looks like intelligence, but is actually just experience with the specific type of document. She looked up. He wrote this for a room with no one in it, who could see all three provisions simultaneously, she said. Yes, you can see it. I have been watching for it since the last year, I said. He identified me 9 months ago as the analyst he was designing around. She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone computing options. You need to be in the capital within 48 hours, she said. I need to be in the capital in 36 hours. I want to arrive with enough time to read the full text against the kingdom's existing treaty framework before the ceremony, not to walk in at the door. She was already writing orders. She had, I noticed, the same habit as Raymond, writing things down that needed to become plans before they were plans. She had learned this somewhere. It was a useful habit, and she had made it her own. I can coordinate with the king's chamberlain to hold the ceremony window, she said. Not cancel, hold. 2 hours. He will not want to cancel a treaty his nobles have been celebrating. The Eastern War is won. The Western War is won. The reparations have been announced to the nobles already. He will give 2 hours if a royal advisory officer requests a formal legal review. He will not give more. Can you authorize a formal legal review? My position as royal liaison officer gives me a formal advisory role in treaty ratification. I can request the review with cause. She paused. Is there a cause that holds legally? Section 12 of the Border Framework Code requires any provision creating ambiguous sovereignty to receive a 48-hour review period with an advisory panel present, I said. There are 3 provisions in this treaty that create ambiguous sovereignty under the code's definition. The 48-hour review was not conducted. The ratification is procedurally deficient as written. Clarice looked at me. You memorized Section 12 of the Border Framework Code. I read 2,000 pages of treaty law in the past 9 months, I said. Sieghart designed a threat that operates in legal form. The only response to a legal threat is legal preparation. She looked at me for another moment, with the expression I had come to recognize as her assessment register, deciding whether what she was seeing matched what she had been told to expect. Then, she made a decision I could see happen in the way she set down her pen. The king knew Sieghart was coming, she said. He told me 6 months ago that the peace process would require someone who could read what he was trying to build. He said you were the only one. He also said you would be occupied in the West when the treaty arrived. I stared at her. He knew, she said. He positioned me here specifically so that when you needed the 2-hour window, there was someone with the authority to request it. I thought about the merit ceremony, the specific warmth the king had delivered when he said the kingdom's greatest calamity is coming. The way he had smiled when I said I would respond with loyalty, commensurate with the honor. He had been ahead of me, not by much, but by enough. Start writing, Clarice said. I was writing before she finished the sentence. There is a specific quality to a journey made in urgency that is not quite fear and not quite hope. something between them, in the register of a man who has prepared everything he could prepare and is now moving through the space where preparation runs out and speed begins. I had a cavalry escort, and I had Bart's spatial storage reducing the supply load, and I had the specific motivation of a man who has watched everything he built be used as the distraction for an attack he did not fully anticipate. Sieghart had designed the war to clear the capital's attention while he worked in the room. He had designed my absence into the plan. He had not made a mistake. He had simply encountered a situation in which his model of the threat was accurate, but his model of the countermeasure was not. He knew I was the analyst who would see through the treaty. He did not know Clarice existed, or what she could authorize, or that I had spent 9 months reading treaty law in the specific anticipation that the threat would arrive in legal rather than military form. The capital was 18 hours at full cavalry speed. I had 34 hours. I kept riding. Riding gives you time to think, which is sometimes useful and sometimes the thing you least need. I had covered the Western engagement, the First Prince's surrender, the treaty text, Clarice's authorization, and Sieghart's design in the first 6 hours. After that, I was riding with the specific mental state of a man who has processed every available variable and reached the end of what thinking can add and is now simply moving. Anne was riding beside me. She had not asked whether to come. She had been beside me since the courtyard meeting with Weiss and Clarice, and when I rode, she rode. This was her specific form of loyalty, not statements of intention, but presence at the point of need, without announcement or explanation. After the 7th hour, she said, "What is the review panel if Clarice gets the window?" "Me, the king's chief legal advisor, and 2 representatives from the Treaty Commission," I said. "Minimum. The panel can expand if additional expertise is requested." "Can Clarice be on the panel?" "She can request to be included as a royal liaison. The king will allow it. And the panel takes the treaty apart provision by provision, section by section," I said, "with reference to the existing legal framework. Section 12 allows the panel to recommend suspension of specific provisions pending further review. We do not need to reject the treaty. We need to suspend the 3 provisions and send them to a formal 48-hour review with the Northern Alliance partners present." Anne was quiet for a moment. "The Northern Alliance partners know what they have in that mutual defense clause," she said. "They will not agree to anything that weakens it. That is the point. Once the partners are in the room, Sieghart's 3 provisions cannot survive the scrutiny. The sovereignty ambiguity resolves against the empire when you put the alliance treaty text beside it. The trade dependency structure is indefensible when the Northern partners' merchants explain what it costs them, and the consultation language without binding mechanism is exactly what the alliance was designed to prevent. Sieghart knew this, Anne said. Sieghart designed the treaty for a room without the alliance partners, I said. He designed it for a victory celebration, where the reparations and territorial concessions are the story, and the administrative provisions are footnotes. He was correct that the footlines would survive in that room. He was not planning for the alliance partners arriving before the ratification. Anne thought about this. How does he not know the partners will arrive once the review is called? She said. He might know. He may have planned a countermove. That is what we do not yet know. Anne said nothing further. She kept writing. So did I. I thought about Sieghart for the next 2 hours, in the specific way you think about an antagonist you have never met, but who has been shaping your situation for 9 months. He was not someone who made the kind of mistakes that came from arrogance or personal attachment. He was someone who made the kind of mistakes that came from an accurate model of the situation, encountering a variable the model did not include. His model had been accurate about me. He had correctly identified my analytical capability. He had correctly identified that I would be in the West when the treaty arrived. He had correctly designed the military operation to put me there. He had not included Clarice in his model because Clarice had not been visible in the kingdom's diplomatic apparatus when his model was built. She had been a princess attending a foreign court as an observer. She had not yet been appointed to the royal liaison role. The appointment had happened after the Fair Art mission, which was after his model was constructed. He had not included the 2,000 pages of treaty law I had read in the past 9 months, because nothing in his intelligence suggested that a 19-year-old frontier count would spend 9 months reading treaty law in anticipation of a legal form threat rather than a military one. He had not planned for the king knowing. The king positioning Clarice specifically for this scenario was not in any intelligence picture Sieghart could have built, because the king had not told anyone he was doing it. He had moved Clarice into position through a set of decisions that looked, from the outside, like normal diplomatic appointments. The king was, I was finding, consistently better at this than anyone around him assumed. The capital was 18 hours at full cavalry speed. I had 34 hours. I kept writing. There is a version of this story where I arrive in time. There is a version where I arrive at the door as the ceremony ends. There is a version where Clarice's 2-hour hold is granted, and I walk into the review panel and take the treaty apart clause by clause in front of the assembled nobles, and the king recognizes what Sieghart built, and the ratification is postponed for a full legal review. I cannot tell you which version happened, because I was writing when the story ends. What I can tell you is what I knew to be true as I wrote. The 5 faces from the execution pyre were all alive, in rooms behind me that I had built, with the knowledge of what I was and the choice to stay. The disasters on the list were all averted or managed. The brother who was supposed to die at 13 was a frontier viscount commanding his own forces. The mages recruited from orphanages and refugee camps were defending the kingdom that had once let everything burn. Weiss, who had set me on fire in a timeline that no longer existed, had just won me a war. The book beside the crib had recorded 5 catastrophes and told me I would die at 20. I had been 3 years old and unable to walk, and I had read the book by moonlight and decided that the knowledge was not a sentence. It was a warning. I had spent 2 lifetimes being told I was less than what I needed to be. I had decided at 20, burning at a stake, that if I ever got another chance, I would build something that held. I thought I had done that, whether I was in time to prove it, whether the treaty could be stopped, whether the northern alliances held, whether Sieghart had calculated more precisely than I could counter. That was the question I was riding toward. I am still riding. What else? Always what else?